They thought she was just another hostage. Another terrified face in a room full of civilians praying for rescue. But when the barrel pressed cold against her temple, when the leader's hand shook with adrenaline and rage, they made a mistake that would cost them everything. They didn't know Lieutenant Commander Sofia Brennan had spent 12 years teaching Navy SEALs how to turn chaos into opportunity. And tonight, in a jewelry store in downtown Portland, that education was about to be demonstrated in the most brutal clarity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the shattered display cases. Broken glass crunched under boots as 3 armed men moved through Meridian Fine Jewelers like predators who'd already won. It was 9:47 p.m. on a Thursday, 17 minutes after closing, and the store should have been empty. Should have been locked. But Sofia had stayed late to pick up a watch repair. A vintage piece her father had worn in Vietnam. And now she knelt on cold marble alongside the store manager and a young couple who'd been browsing when the metal security gate came crashing down. The leader called himself Vargas, though she doubted that was real. His voice carried the sandpaper roughness of someone who'd spent years shouting orders, and the tactical vest he wore was military surplus, probably stolen. His partners flanked the room, one covering the entrance, another sweeping a duffel bag across the counter, shoveling diamond rings and gold chains into its depths with gloved hands. They moved with practiced efficiency. This wasn't their first robbery, but something had gone wrong. The silent alarm had triggered earlier than they'd planned. Police response time in this district was 4 minutes. They'd been inside for 6. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer, and with every passing second, Vargas's movements became more erratic, more desperate. He paced between the hostages, the Glock 19 in his hand gesturing wildly as he barked into a radio, trying to coordinate an escape route that was rapidly closing. Sofia remained perfectly still. Her hands were zip-tied in front of her, not behind, an amateur mistake. Her breathing was controlled, measured, each inhale through her nose, each exhale through slightly parted lips. She'd learned this rhythm in Hell Week, in the cold waters off Coronado, in rooms designed to break you mentally before they ever touched you physically. The ability to regulate your nervous system when everything around you screamed panic. It was the first lesson. The one that separated operators from everyone else. The store manager beside her was hyperventilating, his shoulders shaking. The young woman across from them sobbed quietly, mascara streaking down her cheeks as her boyfriend held her with bound hands. Normal reactions. Expected reactions. Sofia let her gaze drift past them, cataloging details with the detached precision of someone conducting a tactical assessment. 3 hostiles. 1 M4 carbine, likely semi-auto civilian variant. 2 handguns, 1 Glock, 1 possibly a Sig Sauer based on the grip profile. Body armor on Vargas only. The other 2 were heavy jackets, possibly concealing plates, but their movement suggested otherwise. The front entrance was blocked by their vehicle, a black Suburban, with plates removed. Rear exit led to an alley, 12 feet wide, dumpster on the left providing cover. Fire escape accessible from the roof of the adjacent building. Her mind worked through scenarios like flipping through a tactical manual. Probability matrices. Risk assessments. Acceptable casualties versus optimal outcomes. But she kept her expression neutral, her posture submissive, her presence forgettable. It was a skill set that had taken years to perfect. How to be underestimated. How to become invisible until the exact moment you needed to be seen. Vargas's radio crackled. Units responding, ETA 90 seconds. His jaw clenched. He turned toward the hostages, and Sofia saw it in his eyes before he said a word. The shift from robbery to something darker. Desperation makes men dangerous in predictable ways, And she'd seen this particular calculation before. In Kandahar. In Ramadi. In a dozen rooms where oxygen turned thin and time compressed into a single heartbeat's worth of decision. "We need leverage," Vargas snapped to his partners. He grabbed Sofia by the arm, hauling her to her feet with enough force to make the store manager gasp. She didn't resist. Didn't pull away. Just rose smoothly, letting her body language communicate compliance. Even as her mind accelerated through contingencies, he dragged her toward the window, where red and blue lights were beginning to strobe across the glass. Police cruisers screeching to a halt outside, doors opening, officers taking position behind vehicles. A negotiator would be setting up, protocols engaging. The machinery of law enforcement moving through its established procedures. And that's when Vargas made his final mistake. He pressed the Glock against her right temple, the barrel cold and unyielding, and pulled her in front of the window like a human shield. His voice rose, projecting toward the police outside, announcing his demands with the kind of bravado that comes from someone who's watched too many movies and not enough real operators work. "Back off or she dies," he screamed, spittle flying. "I will put a bullet in her head right now." The room crystallized into absolute silence. Even the manager's hyperventilating stopped. The young couple stared in horror. Vargas's partners shifted nervously, suddenly aware they were in territory far beyond smash dash and dash grab. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sofia stood perfectly still. Her pulse didn't spike. Her hands didn't tremble. She simply breathed, slow and deliberate. The kind of breath that comes not from fear, but from someone who's already 3 moves ahead. She could feel the tremor in Vargas's hand, the moisture of his palm through his glove, the tension in his forearm muscles. Amateur grip. Finger on the trigger. Too much pressure, compensating for adrenaline. If he fired, the recoil would be erratic, possibly non-fatal depending on angle and her movement. But he wasn't going to fire. She already knew that. The barrel twitched against her skin as his breathing became ragged. Panicked. He was waiting for her to beg, to cry, to give him the psychological confirmation that he held power in this moment. That the gun made him dangerous. Instead, Sofia exhaled once, long and measured. The sound somehow louder than the sirens outside. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost conversational, carrying the kind of calm that doesn't come from bravery, but from absolute certainty. "You should take that finger off the trigger," she said softly, "before you lose the hand." The words landed like stones in still water. Vargas froze. His partners froze. Even the police outside seemed to hold their breath, watching through rifle scopes and tactical binoculars. For the first time since the robbery began, Vargas looked down at the woman he was threatening. Really looked. And saw something in her eyes that made his blood turn cold. Not fear. Recognition. The kind of look a wolf gives a dog who's forgotten they were once the same animal. The silence that followed Sofia's words wasn't empty. It was thick, suffocating, the kind that presses against eardrums and makes heartbeats sound like thunder. Vargas's finger twitched on the trigger, but it didn't pull. Couldn't pull. Because somewhere in the primitive part of his brain, the part that had kept his ancestors alive when saber-toothed predators stalked the plains, a warning signal was screaming. This woman wasn't afraid, and that made her the most dangerous thing in the room. "What? What did you just say?" His voice cracked on the last word, betraying him. The bravado from 30 seconds ago evaporated like steam. His partners glanced at each other, confusion rippling across their faces. They'd done this before. Held people at gunpoint. Watched them cry, beg, promise anything for their lives. The script was always the same, but Sofia wasn't following the script. She didn't turn her head. Didn't try to look at him. Just kept her gaze forward, fixed on the police lights strobing through the window. Her posture relaxed in a way that defied every instinct a hostage should have. When she spoke again, her tone carried the patience of an instructor correcting a student who'd made an obvious mistake. Your grip is too tight. Thumb placement is wrong. And you're telegraphing every micro-movement through your breathing. She paused, letting each observation settle. You've never actually shot someone, have you? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Vargas's jaw worked, trying to form words, but his throat had gone dry. Behind him, the partner at the door, a wiry man with a neck tattoo, shifted his weight nervously. Vargas, what is she? Shut up, Vargas hissed, but there was no authority in it now. Just the desperate edge of someone realizing they'd walked into something they didn't understand. Sofia's voice remained steady, almost kind, the way a doctor might explain a terminal diagnosis. The police outside have 3 designated marksmen by now. At least 2 with clear sight lines through this glass. They're watching your trigger discipline. Every movement. Every hesitation. She exhaled slowly, deliberately. You pull that trigger, and even if you somehow manage to hit me, you'll be dead before my body drops. Is that what you want? The barrel pressed harder against her temple, but it was shaking now, trembling. The physical manifestation of control slipping away. You think you're smart? Vargas snarled, trying to reclaim dominance through volume. You think you can talk your way out of this? No, Sofia said simply. I think you're going to make a choice. And I'm giving you the information you need to make the smart one. One of the hostages, the young woman on the floor, let out a choked sob. Her boyfriend pulled her closer, both of them staring at Sofia like she'd lost her mind. The store manager's eyes were wide, disbelieving. Nobody talked to armed robbers like this. Nobody stayed this calm with a gun to their head. But Sofia had been in rooms where guns were just tools, not threats. Where the real danger wasn't the weapon, but the fear it created. And fear, she'd learned long ago, was optional. Here's what happens next, she continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, forcing Vargas to lean in to hear her. You have about 45 seconds before tactical units breach that door. They won't negotiate. They won't hesitate. You've already escalated this past the point of talking it down. She let that sink in. Or, you lower the weapon, you walk out that rear exit while they're still focused on the front. And you have maybe a 3-minute head start before they realize you're gone. Vargas's breathing was ragged now, his chest heaving against her back. She could feel his indecision, the war between ego and survival playing out in real time. Why would you tell me that? He demanded, suspicion coating every syllable. Because I don't want to fill out the paperwork, Sofia said, and for the first time, there was the ghost of something in her voice. Not quite humor. More like the weary pragmatism of someone who'd seen too much blood and decided it wasn't always necessary. And because you're not a killer, you're just a thief who made bad decisions. Don't add murder to the list. The gun barrel wavered, lifted slightly from her temple. Not much, maybe an inch. But in that tiny space, the entire dynamic shifted. Outside, a bullhorn crackled to life. This is Portland Police. Release the hostages and come out with your hands visible. Vargas's partners were backing toward the rear exit now, their nerve breaking. The one with the duffel bag was already at the door, hand on the crash bar. Vargas, we gotta go, man, now. Time compressed. Decision point approaching. Sofia could feel it in the tension of his muscles, the rhythm of his breathing, the way his weight shifted from foot to foot. This was the moment. The pivot. Where violence either erupted or dissolved. She turned her head slightly, just enough to catch his eye in her peripheral vision. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. You're going to lower that weapon. You're going to walk out that door. And you're going to tell yourself this was a strategic retreat. She paused. Because the alternative is that I take it from you. And trust me when I say you don't want to see how that ends. It wasn't a threat. Threats are loud, aggressive, designed to intimidate. This was something else entirely. A statement of fact delivered with the same casualness someone might use to mention the weather. And in that moment, Vargas felt it. The shift. The undeniable truth that he'd never been in control. That from the moment he grabbed her, he'd been walking a path she'd already mapped out. That the gun in his hand was irrelevant because she'd decided exactly how this would end. His hand dropped. The Glock lowered from her temple. Moving almost involuntarily, his fingers loosening on the grip. Smart choice, Sofia said quietly. Vargas stumbled backward. His face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. His partners were already out the rear exit, the crash bar clanging. He looked at Sofia one last time. Searching for something, an explanation maybe. Or confirmation that what just happened was real. She simply stood there, hands still zip-tied, posture relaxed. Eyes reflecting the kind of calm that comes from having nothing left to prove. He ran. The door slammed behind him. And the sound of running footsteps faded into the alley. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. The store manager stared at Sofia in absolute shock. The young couple clung to each other, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. The police lights continued strobing through the glass. Unaware that the crisis had just resolved itself, Sofia walked calmly to the counter, picked up a shard of glass, and cut through her zip ties with practiced efficiency. The plastic fell away, and she rubbed her wrists briefly before reaching for her phone in her jacket pocket. She dialed a number from memory. It rang once. "Brennan," she said simply when someone answered. "Yeah, it's handled." 3 suspects fleeing south through the Pearl District alley system. Black Suburban parked at the front, plates removed. "Send a cleanup team to Meridian Fine Jewelers." A pause. "No, nobody hurt. I'll file the report in the morning." She hung up. The store manager found his voice shaky and confused. Who are you?" Sofia picked up the small box containing her father's watch from where it had fallen during the chaos. She checked the repair work, satisfied, then slipped it into her pocket. "Nobody special," she said. "Just someone who was in the right place at the right time." But as she walked toward the door to brief the police officers who were about to breach, everyone in that room knew they'd just witnessed something extraordinary. They'd seen what happens when someone who's been trained to never lose meets someone who still believes a gun makes them powerful, and the gun had lost 6 weeks earlier. Sofia Brennan had walked through the gates of Naval Station Cascade with a reputation that preceded her like a shadow. She carried a weathered olive-drab backpack, a steel travel mug that never left her hand, and the kind of quiet confidence that made senior officers stop mid-conversation when she passed. She wasn't there to make friends. She was there because the Navy had a problem. And problems like hers required solutions that couldn't be found in textbooks. Cascade Naval Station sat 40 miles north of Portland. Nestled between dense pine forests and the Columbia River, it was a training facility. Primarily, where new recruits learned the basics and seasoned operators refined their edges. But recently, the base had been selected for something different. A joint interagency training program designed to bridge the gap between military special operations and federal law enforcement. FBI hostage rescue teams, ATF tactical units, and de-enforcement divisions would train alongside Navy personnel in a 6-week intensive that promised to revolutionize how agencies approached high-risk scenarios. Sofia had been handpicked to lead the combat psychology module. Not because she was the most decorated, though her service record spoke for itself. Not because she was the loudest voice in the room, because she rarely spoke unless necessary. But because over 12 years of operational deployment, she'd developed a methodology that had saved more lives than any weapon system the military had ever fielded. She taught people how to think when thinking became impossible, how to find stillness in the center of storms, how to turn terror into tactical advantage. The base commander, Rear Admiral Marcus Holt, had met her at the administration building on her first morning. He was a career officer with 3 decades of service, a man whose uniform carried enough ribbons to tell stories he'd never speak aloud. He'd reviewed her file extensively. Read the after-action reports, the psychological evaluations, the commendations from operations that remained classified even in retirement. "Commander Brennan," he'd said, shaking her hand with the firm grip of someone who still believed in old-school formalities. "Your reputation is impressive. I hope you can translate field experience into classroom instruction. Some of our instructors struggle with that transition." Sofia had met his gaze steadily. "I don't plan on using a classroom, sir." Holt's eyebrow raised. "No? Can't teach stillness in a lecture hall. Can't demonstrate control with PowerPoint slides." She took a sip from her steel mug, the coffee inside still steaming despite the early hour. "I need access to the kill house, the urban warfare facility, and permission to run unscripted scenarios. The kind where students don't know when the training starts or ends." There was a long pause. Holt studied her, weighing protocols against results. Finally, he nodded. "You have operational latitude. Just don't break anyone." "Can't make promises, sir," Sofia had replied with the faintest hint of something that might have been humor. "But I'll try to keep the hospital visits to a minimum." Her first session had been scheduled for 0600 hours, 3 days after her arrival. 24 students filed into what they assumed would be a briefing room. Instead, they found an empty warehouse space with concrete floors, exposed steel beams, and a single folding chair in the center where Sofia sat, eyes closed, breathing at a rhythm so steady it looked rehearsed. The students shuffled in, confused, whispering among themselves. FBI agents in tactical pants and polo shirts. D operators with the hard eyes of people who'd seen the cartels up close. Navy SEALs who thought they'd already learned everything worth knowing. They waited for instructions, for introductions, for the shape of this course to reveal itself. Sofia didn't move, didn't acknowledge them, just breathed. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The whispers grew louder, impatience creeping in. One of the FBI agents, a broad-shouldered man named Cortez with 15 years in hostage rescue, finally spoke up. "Excuse me, Commander. Are we starting, or?" Sofia's eyes opened. She didn't stand, didn't raise her voice, just looked at him with the kind of focus that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "You've been standing in an ambush kill zone for 11 minutes, she said calmly. 3 simulated shooters have had clean shots at 8 of you. 4 others positioned themselves with their backs to entry points. 2 of you are standing directly under structural weak points that would collapse under explosive breach." She took another sip of coffee. "And not one of you noticed the live recording equipment documenting every tactical failure for review." The room went silent. Heads turned, scanning the rafters, the corners, the shadows. Sure enough, small cameras with blinking red lights were mounted at strategic angles. And in the far corner, partially concealed by a support beam, 3 laser designators painted red dots across various student center mass. "Situational awareness isn't optional," Sofia continued. "Standing now, moving through the group with the unhurried pace of someone conducting an inspection. It's not a skill you activate when you think danger is present. It's a state of being, a frequency you tune into and never leave." She stopped in front of a younger SEAL, barely 25, his jaw tight with embarrassment. "What's your name?" "Petty Officer Nash, ma'am." "You're dead, Nash. Laser found you at minute 3. You spent the last 8 minutes checking your phone." She moved on before he could respond. "The human brain processes 11 million pieces of information per second. You consciously notice about 40. Training increases that ratio. Meditation, breath work, cognitive conditioning, these aren't hippie nonsense. They're force multipliers. She gestured to the folding chair. I sat in perfect stillness for 11 minutes while you all assumed nothing was happening. That's control. That's the baseline we're building from. And a TF agent, a woman named Rhodes with sharp features and sharper questions, raised her hand. With respect, Commander, we're action-oriented professionals. How does sitting quietly translate to hostage rescue or raid operations? Sofia turned to face her fully. Tell me, Agent Rhodes, what's the first thing that happens in a high-stress scenario? Adrenaline spike. Fight or flight response. And what does that do to fine motor skills? Degrades them. Decision-making? Becomes reactive instead of strategic. Exactly. Sofia walked to the center of the room again. Every operation, every crisis, every moment where lives hang in the balance, your body wants to panic. Evolution designed you to run from predators, not engage with them. We're going to reprogram that response. She looked around the room, making eye contact with each student. By the end of this course, you'll be able to lower your heart rate on command. You'll control adrenaline instead of it controlling you. You'll find stillness in gunfire, clarity in chaos. Not because you're fearless, but because you've trained your nervous system to treat fear as information rather than instruction. The skepticism was palpable. These were hardened operators, people who'd earned their credentials through blood and sweat. The idea that breathing exercises would somehow make them more effective felt like new age distraction. Sofia saw it in their faces. She'd seen it before. Every course started this way. Let me tell you a story, she said, her voice dropping to conversational level, the tone of someone sharing something true rather than teaching something theoretical. 3 years ago, I was part of an extraction team in Mogadishu. Hostage situation, American journalist held by militia fighters in a compound with zero cover approaches. We had a 12-hour window before he was moved to a location we couldn't track. Standard breach would have gotten him killed. Too much noise, too much chaos, too many angles they could execute from. She paused, letting the scenario build in their minds. So I walked in the front door, alone, unarmed. That got their attention. Even the skeptics leaned forward slightly. I knocked. They answered. I told them I was a doctor from an NGO, there to check on the hostage's medical condition, that his government had agreed to pay ransom but needed proof of life. They didn't believe me at first. Guns in my face, shouting, the whole performance. Sofia's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested she was watching the memory play out in real time. I stood there, didn't flinch, didn't argue, just waited, breathed, let the silence do the work. Eventually, their adrenaline crashed. They started questioning each other instead of me. I asked for water. They brought it. I asked to see the hostage. They showed me. I checked his vitals, treated a minor infection, told them he'd die without antibiotics, which would mean no ransom. They let you leave? Nash asked, disbelief evident. They escorted me out, gave me a timeline for the antibiotics. I came back 6 hours later with medical supplies and a strike team positioned on every approach vector. We extracted the journalist without firing a shot. She let that sink in. Control isn't about domination. It's about dictating the pace, owning time, making chaos work for you instead of against you. The room was silent now, but it was a different kind of silence. Not confusion, attention. That's what we're building here, Sofia said. Not warriors. We have enough of those. We're building something rarer. People who can walk into hell and come out the other side without becoming demons themselves. Agent Rhodes spoke again, but this time the skepticism was gone. When do we start? Sofia smiled barely. You already did. Everyone who positioned themselves near exits instead of exposure points passed the first test. The rest of you have some catching up to do." She walked toward the warehouse door, then paused at the threshold. "Tomorrow, 0500 hours. Bring nothing but yourselves. No weapons, no gear, no expectations. Just show up ready to unlearn everything you think makes you dangerous." And with that, she was gone, leaving 24 highly trained operators standing in an empty warehouse, suddenly aware of how much they didn't know. Outside, Admiral Holt stood watching from a distance. His aide, a young lieutenant, stood beside him with a tablet displaying the warehouse camera feeds. "Think she can pull this off, sir?" the lieutenant asked. Holt watched Sofia disappear into the morning mist, her silhouette fading like smoke. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "I've watched that woman walk through situations that would break most people. If anyone can teach these operators to think like her, it's her." He turned back toward the administration building. "I just hope they're ready for what that actually means." By the second week of training, Sofia had earned a nickname among the students, the Ghost. Not because she was quiet, though she often was, but because of the way she moved through scenarios like she existed half a step outside of normal time. She'd appear in simulations without warning, standing in places no one should have been able to reach undetected. She'd correct techniques with a touch so subtle students would only realize their stance had changed after the fact. And when she demonstrated combat applications, her movements carried an economy that made violence look like meditation, but it wasn't. Sofia who would define the course's trajectory. It was the man who'd been watching her with increasing resentment since the day she arrived. Senior Chief Tactical Instructor Damian Cross had been at Naval Station Cascade for 7 years. He was the face of the base's tactical training programs, a former DEVU operator with a chest full of medals and a teaching style built on intensity and volume. His methods were proven, effective, and deeply rooted in the culture of military aggression. He taught warriors to be harder, faster, more overwhelming than any threat they'd face. When violence was inevitable, he'd tell his students, "You didn't hesitate. You didn't negotiate. You destroyed the problem before it destroyed you." And now this woman, with her breathing exercises and philosophical tangents about stillness, was being held up as some kind of revolutionary instructor. It grated on him like sandpaper on exposed nerve. Cross was 42, built like a linebacker, with a shaved head and a voice that could strip paint off walls when he wanted it to. He'd earned his reputation through 2 decades of operations that remained classified, through firefights that had tested him in ways most people couldn't comprehend. He didn't just teach tactics. He embodied them. His students feared him, respected him, and emerged from his courses harder than when they'd entered. But lately, he'd noticed something that made his jaw clench. His students were spending their off hours asking Sofia questions, seeking her input on psychological preparation, talking about owning the pause and tactical stillness like it was some kind of secret doctrine. Some of them had even started incorporating her breathing techniques into their pre-mission routines. That it felt like erosion, like his authority was being undermined by someone who'd never even attended his courses, who operated on principles that seemed antithetical to everything he'd built his career on. The breaking point came during a joint training exercise in the 3rd week. The scenario was straightforward. A simulated hostage situation in the base's urban warfare facility. A mock-up of a Middle Eastern compound complete with narrow corridors, multiple floors, and civilian role-players mixed among hostile actors. Cross's students were running the operation. A full breach and extract with live simunition rounds and stress inoculation protocols designed to push decision-making to its limits. Sofia had been invited to observe. Just observe. Admiral Holt wanted her perspective on how the base's standard tactical training interfaced with her psychological conditioning methods. She'd agreed, standing in the observation tower overlooking the facility, watching through reinforced glass as Cross's team stacked up outside the target building. The breach was textbook. Explosive entry, immediate room clearing, overwhelming speed and violence of action. Flashbangs detonated, filling rooms with artificial chaos. Simunition rounds cracked through the air as targets were engaged. The team moved like a machine, each operator covering angles, communicating through hand signals and short, verbal cues, but something was wrong. Sofia saw it within the first 30 seconds. The team was so focused on speed, so committed to their momentum, that they weren't processing information. They'd passed a room marked with a blue flag, the universal signal for civilian presence requiring soft clearance. Their momentum carried them forward, leaving it uncleared. In a real scenario, that would be a hostile position at their 6. A fatal oversight. She keyed into the observation room's intercom. "Stop the exercise." Cross, who'd been watching from the control booth, spun toward her. "Excuse me?" "Stop the exercise," Sofia repeated, her voice calm but firm. "They've created a critical vulnerability. This is a hot drill, Commander. We don't stop hot drills for observation notes." Cross's voice carried an edge that made the junior technicians in the control booth suddenly very interested in their monitors. You do when the observation prevents a training scar that could kill people in the field. The tension in the room crystallized. Cross stared at her, his jaw working, weighing whether to pull rank or engage the argument. Sofia simply waited, her expression neutral, hands clasped behind her back. She wasn't challenging him. She was stating a fact. The distinction mattered, but Cross didn't see it that way. "Fine," he said finally, his voice tight. He keyed his radio. "All units, freeze in place." Exercise paused for instructor review. The bite in his tone made it clear who he blamed for the interruption. Sofia walked down from the observation tower, through the control room, and into the facility itself. Cross followed, his boots heavy on the concrete, broadcasting his irritation with every step. The tactical team stood frozen in their positions, confused. Adrenaline still high from the interrupted momentum. She walked past them, saying nothing until she reached the room they bypassed. The blue flag hung on the doorframe, clearly visible. She gestured to it. "Why didn't you clear this room?" The team leader, a Navy lieutenant named Vickers who'd been through Cross's program twice, looked at the flag, then at his team, realization dawning across his face. We were maintaining momentum. Didn't want to break the flow of the breach. And now? Sofia asked, her tone not accusatory, just curious. Vickers swallowed. "Now we have an uncleared room behind our advance position. Could be hostile. Could be civilians we'd use as leverage against us. Could be an ambush waiting to collapse our line." "Could be," Sofia agreed. She looked at the rest of the team. Speed is a tool, not a strategy. Momentum without awareness is just controlled chaos. And chaos doesn't discriminate between hostiles and friendlies when it bites back. Cross stepped forward, his physical presence meant to reclaim authority. "With respect, Commander, we train for decisive action. Hesitation gets people killed. We teach our operators to trust their training, to move with confidence and overwhelming force. Second-guessing in the middle of an operation is how mistakes compound." Sofia turned to face him fully. It was the first time they'd directly engaged, and everyone in the facility seemed to sense the weight of the moment. Two philosophies, two approaches, standing face to face in a room that suddenly felt much smaller. "I agree," Sofia said. "Hesitation is fatal. But so is blindness. There's a difference between confidence and assumption." She gestured to the tactical team. "These operators are skilled. Their breach was clean, their movement was professional. But they weren't thinking. They were executing. And execution without assessment creates predictable patterns. Predictable patterns get exploited. We train to eliminate thinking under stress," Cross countered, his voice rising slightly. "Train hard, fight easy. You drill the response until it's instinct. You don't pause in the middle of a firefight to assess philosophical implications. I'm not suggesting philosophy, Sofia replied, her voice still level. I'm suggesting awareness. 2 seconds of observation before the breach would have caught that flag. One operator assigned to rear security would have prevented the vulnerability. Neither of those requires hesitation. They require discipline. Discipline is following your training. Discipline is knowing when your training needs adaptation. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Cross's face had gone red, his fists clenched at his sides. Around them, the tactical team and role players watched with the kind of attention people reserve for moments they know they'll remember. My methods, Cross said, his voice dropping to something dangerous, have kept operators alive in Fallujah, in Helmand, in places you've probably only read about in briefings. I've earned my approach through blood and experience. You want to teach meditation and breathing exercises, that's fine. But don't walk into my facility and undermine tactical doctrine that's been proven in combat. Sofia didn't blink, didn't retreat, just held his gaze with that same infuriating calm. I've been in those places too, Senior Chief, and I've carried body bags out of operations that failed because people confused aggression with competence. Her voice remained quiet, but something in it made Cross's anger falter. Your methods work. I'm not disputing that, but they work best when they're paired with the ability to adapt, to see, to think. That's not weakness. That's evolution. Cross opened his mouth to respond, but Admiral Holt's voice crackled over the facility intercom before he could. Senior Chief Cross. Commander Brennan, my office. Immediately. The two instructors stared at each other for one more long moment. Then Cross turned on his heel and strode toward the exit, his shoulders rigid with barely contained fury. Sofia followed at her own pace, unhurried, her expression thoughtful. Behind them, Lieutenant Vickers looked at his team. We're going to hear about this for weeks, he muttered. One of his teammates, a DEA agent named Torres, shook his head. I don't know, man. I think we just watched something shift. Not sure which way yet, but something definitely shifted. In Admiral Holt's office, the silence was heavy and expectant. Holt sat behind his desk, fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. Cross stood at parade rest, his posture perfect, but his jaw still tight. Sofia stood beside him, relaxed but attentive. Gentlemen, Holt began, then corrected himself with a glance at Sofia and Commander. We have a problem. This joint training program was designed to create synergy between different operational approaches. Instead, I'm watching two of my senior instructors turn it into a philosophical battleground. He looked between them. I need to know if you can work together or if we need to restructure the entire program. Cross spoke first, his voice carefully controlled. Sir, I have no issue with Commander Brennan's methods in her own courses. But when she interrupts active training exercises to critique established tactical doctrine, it creates confusion among students who need clarity, not debate. Holt turned to Sofia. Commander? Senior Chief Cross is right that students need clarity, Sofia said. But clarity doesn't mean rigidity. The scenario today wasn't a critique of his methods. It was an illustration that even good tactics can create vulnerabilities when applied without adaptation. That's not undermining his doctrine. That's refining it. By stopping a hot drill and publicly questioning the approach, Cross shot back, his control slipping slightly. By preventing a training scar that could cost lives, Sofia countered. Still calm. Holt raised a hand, silencing them both. He leaned back in his chair, studying them with the kind of assessment that came from decades of managing strong personalities in high-stakes environments. Here's what's going to happen, he said finally. You're both excellent at what you do, but you're operating in parallel instead of in concert. So we're going to fix that. He stood, walking to the window overlooking the training grounds. Next week, you'll co-teach a scenario. Not separately, together. You'll design it jointly, execute it jointly, and debrief it jointly. Show me that your approaches can complement each other, or show me why this program needs restructuring. Cross's expression darkened. Sofia's remained neutral. Dismissed, Holt said. They walked out of the office together, the hallway feeling too narrow for the tension between them. As they reached the fork where their paths would diverge, Cross stopped and turned to face Sofia. "This isn't about pride," he said quietly. "It's about keeping people alive. My way works." "So does mine," Sofia replied. "Maybe that's the problem. We're both right. And neither of us knows how to exist in the same space without one of us being wrong." Cross studied her for a long moment, searching for mockery or condescension. He found neither. Just that same steady gaze that seemed to see more than it should. "1 week," he said finally. "We'll see whose approach holds up under pressure." Sofia nodded once. "Looking forward to it, Senior Chief." He walked away, and Sofia stood alone in the hallway, knowing that the real test wasn't coming next week. It had already begun. The joint scenario took 3 days to design. And every hour of those 3 days felt like negotiating a ceasefire between warring nations. Cross wanted a high-intensity assault simulation with time pressure and overwhelming hostile presence. Sofia advocated for psychological complexity, ambiguous threats, and civilian variables that required discrimination rather than blanket aggression. They met in a conference room that smelled of stale coffee and frustration, arguing over whiteboards covered in tactical diagrams and mission parameters. "You're overcomplicating it," Cross said on the second day, erasing one of Sofia's suggested elements with enough force to squeak the marker across the board. "Operators need clear objectives. Identify hostile, eliminate threat, extract package. Adding moral ambiguity just creates paralysis." "Real operations are morally ambiguous," Sofia countered, adding the element back with her own marker. "Hostiles don't wear uniforms. Civilians panic and act unpredictably. If we train people to only handle clean scenarios, we're setting them up to freeze when reality gets messy. Then, we train them to make hard calls quickly. Or, we train them to make informed calls accurately." The back and forth continued until they finally reached something resembling compromise. The scenario would be a hostage rescue in a civilian apartment complex. Multiple hostages, multiple hostiles, but with a twist. Some of the role players would be given instructions to behave in ways that blurred the line between threat and victim. Panicked civilians who picked up weapons. Hostiles who attempted to surrender. Ambiguous body language that could be interpreted as either aggressive or defensive. Time pressure would be present, but not artificial. The students would need to balance speed with assessment. It was uncomfortable for both of them. Cross felt like he was diluting the decisive nature of tactical operations. Sofia worried they were still leaning too heavily toward aggression as default. But Admiral Holt had been clear. Find common ground or explain why it didn't exist. When they presented the scenario to the student group on Friday morning, the reaction was mixed. Some of the operators looked intrigued. Others looked concerned. Lieutenant Vickers, who'd been in the middle of the previous confrontation, raised his hand. "Instructors, are we being evaluated on speed of completion or on decision accuracy?" Cross and Sofia exchanged a glance. They hadn't explicitly discussed that metric. "Both," Sofia said before Cross could answer. "You're being evaluated on outcome. Did you extract the hostages safely? Did you minimize casualties? Did you maintain operational security? How you achieve that is up to you." Cross nodded, adding, "But understand that in real operations, hesitation costs lives. Every second you spend deliberating is a second hostiles can reposition, execute hostages, or call in reinforcements. Find the balance, but don't mistake caution for wisdom." The students dispersed to prepare. and Sofia found herself standing in the empty briefing room with Cross. The silence between them less hostile than it had been, but still carrying weight. "You know they're going to default to aggression," Sofia said quietly. "That's what they've been trained to do. That's what feels safe. And you know that overthinking gets people killed," Cross replied. "I've seen operators die because they tried to be heroes instead of soldiers. I've seen operators create the threats they were trying to prevent because they couldn't tell the difference between fear and hostility," Sofia said. She turned to look at him directly. "We're not enemies, Senior Chief. We want the same thing. We just see different paths to get there." Cross was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he processed that. Finally he said, "My brother was killed in Ramadi. But it wasn't the blast that got him. It was the delay. They'd received intel about a potential ambush. Command told them to hold position and wait for confirmation. He waited, followed orders. And while he was waiting, someone moved the device closer. When it detonated, it took out his entire vehicle." His voice was flat, controlled, but something underneath it ached. "Every second of hesitation is a second the enemy uses against you. That's not philosophy. That's what I watched burn." Sofia absorbed that, understanding shifting in her expression. "My first deployment, I was part of a village clearing operation in Kandahar province. We had intelligence that Taliban fighters were using the compound as a staging area. Solid intel, multiple confirmations. We breached hard, fast, exactly by doctrine. Killed 3 hostiles in the first room." She paused, her eyes distant. "Except they weren't hostiles. They were farmers with old hunting rifles who thought we were raiders. Their wives and children were in the next room. The real Taliban fighters were 2 compounds over. Bad coordinates, good execution, wrong target." She met his eyes. "Every second of certainty, without verification, is a second you might be aiming at the wrong enemy. That's not philosophy either. That's what I carry." The silence that followed was different. Heavier, but somehow less adversarial. 2 people who'd seen the cost of their convictions standing in the ruins of easy answers. "So what do we do?" Cross asked, and for the first time since they'd met, it sounded like an actual question rather than a challenge. "We teach them both," Sofia said. "Speed and assessment. Decisiveness and discrimination. We stop pretending there's only one right way to handle chaos." Cross nodded slowly. "That's harder to teach than either approach alone." "Yes," Sofia agreed. "But that's the job." The scenario ran on Monday morning at 06:00 hours. 12 students divided into 3 teams, each given the same mission parameters, but staged to enter the kill house from different angles at different times. Cross and Sofia observed from the control booth, watching multiple camera feeds that showed every angle of the unfolding operation. The first team, led by Agent Rhodes from a TF, breached with textbook precision. Fast, aggressive, overwhelming. They cleared the first 2 rooms efficiently, zip-tied 2 role players marked as hostiles, and moved toward the primary hostage location. But in room 3, they encountered a role player, a young man in civilian clothes, who was holding a pistol and screaming in simulated panic. He wasn't aiming at them. He was aiming at a door, his hands shaking, his body language screaming terror rather than aggression. "Drop the weapon," Rhodes commanded, her simunition rifle trained on him. The role player didn't drop it. He was following his instructions, behave like a hostage, who'd grabbed a hostile's dropped weapon and was too scared to put it down. Rhodes had 2 seconds to decide. Cross leaned forward in his chair, watching intently. Sofia's expression remained neutral, but her fingers tapped once against her thigh. A micro gesture of tension. Rhodes fired. The simunition round hit the role player in the chest. He dropped, paint marking the impact zone. The team cleared him, moved on, extracted the primary hostages from the next room. Mission complete. 8 minutes elapsed. In the debrief, Cross reviewed the footage. Clean breach, good communication, effective time management. You extracted the hostages with minimal exposure to your team. He paused. But you shot a civilian. Rhodes's face tightened. He was armed and non-compliant with verbal commands. He was terrified and didn't understand what was happening, Sofia added, her voice not accusatory, just observational. His weapon wasn't oriented toward you. His finger wasn't on the trigger. His eyes were on the door, not on your team. Those are tells, information. Did you see them? Rhodes was silent for a moment. I saw a weapon. In a hostile environment. That's the call I made. And in a training scenario, that's a lesson learned, Cross said. In a real operation, that's an international incident and a dead civilian. The question isn't whether you made a call. The question is whether you made the right one. The second team, led by Petty Officer Nash, approached differently. They'd been in Sofia's sessions more than Cross's, and it showed. They breached slower, taking an extra few seconds at each threshold to assess before committing. When they encountered the same panicked role-player with the weapon, Nash used a different approach. "Sir, I need you to point that weapon at the floor," Nash said, his voice firm, but not aggressive. "We're here to help, but I can't do that while you're holding a gun. Point it down. Step back from the door." The role player, still following his instructions to be confused and scared, hesitated. Nash waited, his weapon oriented but not targeted directly at the man. 3 seconds passed. 4. Then the role player slowly lowered the pistol, and Nash's teammate moved in to secure it without firing a shot, but the delay cost them. By the time they reached the primary hostage room, the role players designated as hostiles had executed one of the hostages according to the scenario timeline. Mission complete, but with casualties. Sofia reviewed their footage. You identified the civilian correctly. You prevented an unjustified shooting. But your caution created an opening that cost a hostage's life. She looked at Nash. In this scenario, you saved one life and lost another. How do you calculate that math? Nash looked uncomfortable. I don't know, ma'am. Both outcomes feel wrong. That's because they are, Cross said, not unkindly. Welcome to the reality of operational decision-making. Sometimes there are no clean answers. Sometimes you choose between bad and worse. The third team found something closer to balance. They breached with speed but paused at critical decision points. When they encountered the armed civilian, they split their response, one operator maintaining coverage while another communicated. They secured the weapon quickly but without lethal force, then moved with renewed urgency toward the hostages. They completed the extraction with no civilian casualties and minimal time lost. In the final debrief, with all teams present, Cross and Sofia stood side by side, presenting the outcomes. 3 teams, 3 approaches. 3 different results, Cross began. Team 1 prioritized speed and decisiveness. Team 2 prioritized discrimination and restraint. Team 3 attempted to balance both. Each approach had costs and benefits. The lesson here, Sofia continued, isn't that one method is right and the others are wrong. The lesson is that context determines tactics. Some scenarios require immediate, overwhelming force. Others require patience and assessment. The best operators know which tool to use when. But how do you know? Agent Torres asked from the back. In the moment, how do you decide which approach is right? Cross and Sofia looked at each other. For a moment, it seemed like they might contradict each other again. Then Cross gestured for Sofia to answer. You train both, she said. You make decisiveness and discrimination both into instincts. And then in the moment, you trust your assessment. You won't always be right. But you'll be right more often than if you only know one way to respond. Cross nodded. And you accept that the job is impossible to do perfectly. You're going to make mistakes. People who look for perfect solutions freeze. People who accept imperfect reality and act anyway survive. The students absorbed that, the weight of it settling over the room. As they filed out, Lieutenant Vickers approached the instructors. "That was different," he said. "Harder than training that tells you exactly what to do. But probably more like the real thing." After he left, Sofia and Cross stood in the empty briefing room again. "That wasn't terrible," Cross admitted. "High praise," Sofia replied, the corner of her mouth lifting slightly. "Don't get used to it," Cross said. But there was something less sharp in his tone. They walked out together. And for the first time, it didn't feel like a ceasefire. It felt like the beginning of something that might eventually resemble respect, but neither of them knew how badly that respect was about to be tested. The philosophy sessions happened in the early mornings, before the heat of the day turned the training grounds into shimmering waves of exhaustion. Sofia had claimed a small corner of the base that nobody else seemed to want, a patch of grass near the old ammunition bunkers, far enough from the main facilities that the sounds of drills and engines faded into background static. She'd bring her steel mug of coffee, sit cross-legged on the ground, and wait for whichever students chose to show up. It was always optional. She'd made that clear from the first week. No attendance requirements, no pressure, no official curriculum. Just space for anyone who wanted to understand the principles behind the methodology rather than just the techniques. Some mornings no one came. Other mornings she'd have 5 or 6 students sitting in a loose circle, asking questions that had been rattling around in their heads since the last simulation. Agent Rhodes became a regular. So did Petty Officer Nash. Lieutenant Vickers showed up twice, listened more than he spoke, then started coming every session. Even a few of Cross's more traditional students began appearing, though they'd usually sit at the outer edge of the circle, as if maintaining distance might protect them from being seen as too influenced by Sofia's approach. On a Thursday morning in week 4, 7 students sat with her as the sun broke pink and gold over the tree line. The conversation had started with a technical question about breath control under stress, but had drifted, as these sessions often did, into deeper territory. "I don't understand how you stay calm when everything's falling apart," Nash said. His hands wrapped around a bottle of water like it might anchor him to something solid. "I get the breathing exercises, I understand the theory, but when the scenario goes hot, my brain just whites out. Everything you taught disappears." Sofia took a sip of her coffee, letting the silence stretch long enough that it stopped feeling uncomfortable and started feeling intentional. When she spoke, her voice carried the quality of someone who'd asked herself the same question 1,000 times. "You're expecting calm to be the absence of fear," she said. "It's not. Calm is what happens when you stop fighting the fear and start observing it instead." She set her mug down, gesturing with her hands as if shaping the concept in the air. "Fear is information. Your body telling you that something matters, that stakes are real, that you need to be present. The problem isn't the fear. The problem is when you let fear make your decisions for you." "But how do you separate yourself from it?" Rhodes asked. "When your heart's pounding and your hands are shaking, how do you get enough distance to observe instead of just react?" "Practice," Sofia said simply. "Thousands of hours of practice. You train in low-stakes environments first. You learn to notice your physiological responses when nothing's actually threatening you. Then you gradually increase the pressure until your body learns that elevated heart rate doesn't mean loss of control. It just means you're engaged." She leaned back, looking up at the morning sky. "I'll tell you a story. When I was going through Bud ES, there was a phase called drown-proofing. They bind your hands behind your back, bind your feet together, and throw you in a pool. You have to survive for 5 minutes. Most people panic in the first 30 seconds, because their brain is screaming that they're going to die. The students leaned in, recognizing the shape of a lesson. I panicked too, Sofia continued. First attempt, I thrashed. I fought the water. I tried to muscle my way through it. I barely lasted 2 minutes before the instructors pulled me out. I was furious with myself. Felt like I'd failed some fundamental test of toughness. She smiled slightly, a private memory crossing her face. But one of the instructors, an old frogman who'd been through Vietnam, pulled me aside afterward. He said, "You're fighting the wrong enemy. The water isn't trying to kill you. Your panic is. What did you do differently the second time?" Vickers asked. "I stopped fighting," Sofia said. "I went into that pool, felt my body start to panic, and instead of resisting it, I just watched it. Noticed my heart rate spiking. Noticed the tightness in my chest. Noticed the desperate urge to thrash. And I let all of that happen without acting on it. I floated. Trusted buoyancy. Used tiny movements to keep my face above water instead of big ones that burned oxygen. And I lasted the full 5 minutes. Because you stayed calm," Nash said. "No," Sofia corrected gently. "Because I stayed present. I was terrified the entire time. But I was terrified and functional. That's the difference. Calm isn't the absence of fear. It's the ability to operate alongside it." The group sat with that for a moment, processing. A new voice spoke up from the outer edge of the circle. It was a D agent named Carver, one of Cross's students who rarely attended these sessions. His arms were crossed, his expression skeptical but curious. "Senior Chief Cross says fear is a luxury you can't afford in combat," Carver said. "That you train until the fear response is eliminated, replaced with automatic reaction. That sounds different from what you're teaching." Sofia didn't bristle at the implicit challenge. She'd been expecting this conversation eventually. "It sounds different," she agreed, "but it's not contradictory. Cross is teaching you to trust your training so deeply that you don't have to think in the moment. That's valid. Essential, even. But automatic responses only work when the situation matches your training. When something unexpected happens, when the scenario doesn't fit the template, automation fails. That's when you need the ability to pause, assess, and adapt. But pausing gets you killed," Carver pushed back, echoing Cross's doctrine. "Freezing gets you killed," Sofia clarified. "Pausing is different. A pause can be 1/10 of a second. Just long enough to confirm your target, to check your six, to verify that what you're seeing matches what you think you're seeing. That's not hesitation. That's precision." Rhodes jumped in, her voice thoughtful. "So you're saying Cross's approach and your approach aren't opposites. They're layers. Train the automatic responses for speed, but train the awareness for accuracy." "Exactly," Sofia said. "And the better you get at both, the more they start to feel like the same thing. When you're truly present, truly calm in the way I'm describing, your trained responses happen faster, not slower. Because you're not wasting energy on panic or second-guessing. You see, you assess, you act. All in the same breath." Vickers spoke up, his tone carrying the weight of someone working through a personal realization. "Is that why you're so still all the time? Even when you move, you're still. It's like you're not in a hurry, even when you're moving fast." Sofia considered that. "I learned a long time ago that rushing and speed aren't the same thing. Rushing is chaotic. Speed is controlled. When you're rushing, you're reacting to time like it's an enemy. When you're moving with speed, you're using time as a tool." She picked up her coffee again, the gesture slow and deliberate. "Everything I do, I try to do at exactly the pace it needs to be done. No faster, no slower. That's not a philosophy. It's efficiency. But how do you know the right pace?" Nash asked. "You feel it," Sofia said. "And before you can feel it, you have to be quiet enough to listen. That's what all the breath work is for. That's what the meditation is for. Not to make you soft or passive, but to make you sensitive to what the moment actually requires instead of what your fear tells you it requires. The sun had risen fully now, the morning cool beginning to burn off. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the base waking up fully. Engines turning over, voices calling out commands. The rhythmic cadence of a running formation passing by on the road. Carver, still looking somewhat skeptical but less defensive, asked one more question. Have you ever frozen? In real combat, I mean. Ever had a moment where all this training didn't work? Sofia met his eyes directly, and for a moment, the student saw something flicker across her face. Not regret exactly, but recognition of cost. Yes, she said quietly. Twice, once in Somalia, once in Syria. Both times people died because I hesitated. Not the 10th of a second pause I'm talking about. Real hesitation. The kind where you know what you need to do, but you can't make yourself do it. The circle went very quiet. This wasn't the kind of admission instructors usually made. What happened? Rhodes asked gently. Somalia, I had a shot on a hostile who was moving toward an IED placement. Clear target, clear threat, rules of engagement were satisfied. But he looked young. 16, maybe 17. And I spent 3 seconds wondering if there was another way. By the time I took the shot, he'd already armed the device. It detonated during our extract. 2 members of my team were injured. One lost his leg. Sofia's voice remained steady, but something underneath it carried weight. Syria, I had intelligence that a building was being used as a command post. Solid intel, multiple confirmations. But I've been burned by bad intelligence before, and I spent too long verifying, triple-checking, trying to be certain. By the time we hit the target, they'd evacuated. They hit another position 6 hours later. Killed 4 of our allies. She paused, letting them absorb that. So when I teach you about assessment, about pausing, about verification, I'm not teaching you theory. I'm teaching you the lessons I paid for in blood and failure. And when Senior Chief Cross teaches you about decisiveness, about trusting your training, about acting with conviction, he's teaching you lessons he paid for the same way. She looked around the circle, making eye contact with each student. The point isn't to choose one approach over the other. The point is to understand both deeply enough that you know which one the situation demands, and to accept that sometimes you'll choose wrong, and people will pay for that mistake. And you'll have to carry that, and still show up ready to make the next choice. The silence that followed was heavy, reverent. These students had trained under hard instructors before, had been pushed physically and mentally. But this was different. This was someone showing them the cost of the profession they'd chosen, not to scare them away from it, but to prepare them for carrying it. Eventually, Nash spoke, his voice quiet. Thank you for telling us that, ma'am. I know that couldn't have been easy. Sofia shrugged slightly. Easy doesn't matter. True matters. And the truth is that this job is impossible to do perfectly. Anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or hasn't done it long enough to know better. She stood, brushing grass from her fatigues. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is to be good enough, often enough, that the people counting on you make it home. Everything else is just noise. The students rose as well, gathering their belongings, but moving slowly, reluctant to break the moment. As they dispersed toward the main facilities, Sofia noticed Cross standing about 50 yards away, near the corner of one of the bunkers. He'd been there for at least part of the conversation. Their eyes met across the distance, and he gave her a small nod, barely perceptible, before turning and walking away that it wasn't agreement. Not yet. But it was acknowledgement. And in that space between 2 instructors who'd been at war with each other's philosophies, something had shifted. The students felt it too, even if they couldn't name it. In the mess hall that afternoon, conversations carried a different quality. Less competition between Cross's students and Sofia's, more collaboration. Questions about how to integrate both approaches. Recognition that the instructors weren't actually teaching opposite things. Just different faces of the same, difficult truth. But in the control room where training scenarios were planned and mission parameters were set, tensions were building that neither Sofia nor Cross could see yet, because while they'd been learning to work together, someone else had been watching there. Integration with growing resentment, and that resentment was about to manifest in ways that would test everything both. Instructors had been teaching. Commander Ethan Graves had been the executive officer of Naval Station Cascade for 3 years, and in that time, he'd built a reputation as a man who valued order above all else. Everything on his base ran according to schedules, protocols, and hierarchies that he'd carefully maintained. Officers respected the chain of command. Instructors stayed in their lanes. Training programs followed approved curricula without deviation. It was a system that worked, that produced results, and most importantly, that he controlled. Sofia Brennan's arrival had been an irritation from the start, but one he'd tolerated because Admiral Holt had personally requested her presence. The joint training program was Holt's initiative, his legacy project, and Graves knew better than to openly oppose something the Admiral championed. So he'd smiled, nodded, welcomed Commander Brennan to the base, and watched her carefully from a distance, waiting for her to either fall in line or provide him with justification to remove her. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly she'd gained influence. Not through official channels, through the proper request forms and coordination meetings that Graves insisted upon, but through something far more dangerous, voluntary respect. Students sought her out. Even instructors like Cross, who should have been natural allies in maintaining traditional approaches, had started incorporating her methods into their own teaching. That it grated on Graves in ways he couldn't articulate in official complaints. There was nothing technically wrong with what Sofia was doing. She wasn't violating regulations, wasn't overstepping her assigned authority, wasn't creating safety incidents. But she was operating outside the system he'd built, creating informal power structures that bypassed his oversight, and worst of all, she was doing it with such quiet effectiveness that he looked petty whenever he tried to raise concerns. The morning meeting where everything began to unravel had started like any other. Graves sat at the head of the conference table in the administration building, flanked by his senior staff, operations officer, logistics coordinator, training oversight director, and the base chaplain who always attended for reasons Graves had never fully understood but didn't question. Admiral Holt sat at the opposite end, technically the senior officer, but generally content to let Graves run the day-to-day operations. The agenda covered routine items, facility maintenance schedules, upcoming inspections, personnel rotations. Then they reached training program updates, and Graves saw his opening. "Admiral, I'd like to raise a concern about the joint training program," Graves said, his tone professional, measured. "Specifically, about the integration of non-standard methodologies into established tactical curricula." Holt looked up from the report he'd been scanning. "Go on." "Commander Brennan has been conducting unauthorized training sessions outside of approved schedules," Graves continued. "These sessions lack formal curriculum approval, don't appear in official training logs, and don't follow standard evaluation protocols. I'm concerned about liability and quality control." The training oversight director, a lieutenant commander named Peters who'd always aligned himself with Graves's approach, nodded in agreement. "We've also received feedback from some students that the philosophical content in these sessions creates confusion about operational priorities. There's concern that emphasis on hesitation and assessment contradicts the decisive action training we've spent years developing." Cross, who'd been invited to this particular meeting to provide instructor perspective, shifted in his seat. Graves had expected him to support this line of criticism. Instead, Cross cleared his throat and said, "With respect, Commander, those sessions are voluntary." Students attend because they find value in them. And I haven't seen evidence that it's creating confusion. If anything, the integration has improved their tactical flexibility. Graves's jaw tightened imperceptibly. This was the problem. Even Cross, who should have been an advocate for traditional approaches, had been compromised. The issue isn't whether students find value, Graves pressed. The issue is accountability. We have protocols for curriculum development, review, and approval. Those protocols exist for good reasons. When instructors operate outside those systems, we lose oversight and assume risks we can't properly assess. Admiral Holt set down his report, giving Graves his full attention. Commander Graves, are you suggesting Commander Brennan's teaching is creating safety issues or operational failures? I'm suggesting that we don't have adequate data to know one way or the other, Graves replied smoothly. Her approach hasn't been formally evaluated through proper channels. We're essentially running an unsanctioned experimental program without controls or assessment frameworks. The results speak for themselves, Cross interjected, his voice carrying a note of frustration. Student performance in complex scenarios has improved measurably. Decision-making under ambiguity is sharper. We're seeing better integration between speed and accuracy. Those are the metrics that matter. Anecdotal observations aren't data, Peters countered. We need formal evaluations, standardized testing, peer review. The scientific method exists for reasons. Holt leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Commander Brennan was brought here specifically to introduce new methodologies. The entire point of this joint program is to explore different approaches. If we subject every innovation to the same approval process that produced our current methods, we're just reinforcing existing paradigms. With respect, Admiral, Graves said, his tone sharpening slightly. Paradigms exist because they've been proven effective. Innovation for its own sake isn't progress. It's chaos with better marketing. The room went quiet. That statement had crossed a line, approaching direct criticism of Holt's judgment. Everyone at the table recognized it. Holt's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. Commander Graves, I appreciate your commitment to procedural integrity. But I'm starting to wonder if this concern is about quality control or about control itself. Graves felt heat rising in his face. Admiral, I'm simply advocating for the standards that have kept this base operating effectively for the 3 years you've been XO. Holt finished. Yes, I'm aware. And in that time, this base has been efficient, orderly, and largely unchanging. Which is fine for maintenance operations. Less fine for a training facility that's supposed to prepare operators for evolving threats. He tapped the table once, a gesture that commanded attention. Here's what's going to happen. Commander Brennan's methodologies will be formally evaluated, but not through your standard curriculum approval process. We'll bring in an external assessment team from JSOC. They'll observe, evaluate, and provide independent analysis. If they find her approaches ineffective or harmful, we'll adjust accordingly. If they validate her methods, we'll integrate them formally into the program. Fair? It wasn't fair, not by Graves's estimation, but it also wasn't something he could argue against without looking obstructionist. Understood, Admiral. Good, Holt said. Meeting adjourned. As the officers filed out, Graves lingered, ostensibly gathering his materials but really waiting for an opportunity to speak with Peters privately. When they were alone in the hallway, Graves kept his voice low. We need documentation, he said. If this external assessment is going to be comprehensive, they'll need complete records. Training logs, student evaluations, incident reports. Everything. Peters nodded slowly, understanding the implication. I'll compile a full dossier. Make sure nothing's overlooked. Good, Graves said. And Peters? Pay particular attention to any sessions where standard safety protocols might have been. loosely interpreted. Anything that could suggest recklessness disguised as innovation. Peters hesitated. Are we looking for problems or documenting legitimate concerns? Graves met his eyes. We're ensuring accountability. How that manifests is simply a matter of thorough record keeping. It was a politician's answer, one that gave Peters plausible deniability while making the intent clear. Peters nodded once more and walked away, already mentally reviewing files for anything that could be framed as problematic. Graves stood alone in the hallway, looking out through the window at the training grounds where he could see Sofia in the distance, running through hand-to-hand combat drills with a small group of students. Her movements were precise, economical, demonstrating technique with the kind of mastery that came from decades of practice. Even from this distance, he could see students watching her with the kind of attention that bordered on reverence. That was the problem, he thought. Not that she was ineffective, that she was too effective, too influential, too willing to operate on her own terms rather than within the structures that kept things manageable. He'd spent 3 years building systems that worked. He wasn't going to let one instructor, no matter how skilled, undermine that because she thought traditional approaches were insufficient. If the external assessment was going to be comprehensive, he'd make sure they had every piece of information they needed to see the full picture, including the parts that raised questions about whether Sofia Brennan's unorthodox methods were brilliant innovation or dangerous liability. In his office later that afternoon, Graves pulled up the digital training logs and began reviewing them with the kind of attention lawyers give to contract language. He found what he was looking for in a file from week 2, an incident report, minor and already resolved, about a training scenario where Sofia had allowed students to continue a simulation past the scheduled end time because they'd requested the opportunity to run it, again with different approach. Technically, she'd exceeded her authorized training window. Technically, that was a protocol violation. The fact that no one had been injured, that the exercise had been valuable, that Cross had signed off on it afterward, all of that was context. But context could be framed different ways depending on which facts you emphasized. Graves made a note in his personal file, pattern of disregard for scheduling protocols. Additional examples needed. He continued reviewing, looking for more threads to pull. A student evaluation where someone had mentioned feeling uncomfortable with the intensity of a stress inoculation exercise, even though the same evaluation praised the ultimate value. An equipment checkout form where Sofia had requisitioned simulation ammunition without going through standard approval chains, getting it directly from the range officer instead. None of it was serious. Taken individually, each incident was either minor or easily explained. But compiled together, presented as a pattern, framed as an instructor who consistently prioritized her own judgment over institutional protocols. Graves closed the files and leaned back in his chair. He wasn't fabricating anything. These incidents had happened. He was simply ensuring they were properly documented and contextualized for the external review team. That's what good executive officers did. They maintained standards. They protected institutions from individuals who, however talented, thought the rules didn't apply to them. Outside his window, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the base. Somewhere in one of those shadows, Sofia was teaching students principles that Graves fundamentally didn't understand. Principles about stillness and presence and operating outside conventional frameworks. But Graves understood frameworks, understood how to use them, how to weaponize them when necessary. And he understood that, in any organization, the person who controlled the documentation controlled the narrative. The external assessment team would arrive in 2 weeks. By then, Graves would have a comprehensive file ready for them. Professional, detailed, raising legitimate questions about risk management and procedural compliance, whether Sofia Brennan recognized it yet or not. She was about to discover that innovation without Institutional support was just rebellion waiting to be. Crush. And Commander Ethan Graves had spent his entire career learning how to crush rebellion before it spread across the base. In the small office Sofia had been assigned, she sat reviewing her own notes for the upcoming week. She'd felt the tension in the morning meeting, even though she hadn't been present for it. Cross had mentioned it briefly, warning her that Graves was building a case for greater oversight. Sofia had thanked him for the heads-up, but hadn't seemed particularly concerned. She'd dealt with institutional resistance before. It was part of the job when you operated at the edges of established doctrine. Some people adapted, some resisted, and some tried to protect the status quo at all costs. What she hadn't fully appreciated yet was that Commander Graves fell into that third category, and that he was very, very good at protecting the status quo. The collision between Sofia's way of operating and Graves's way of controlling was inevitable. It had been building since her first week on base, and it was about to reach a breaking point that would force Admiral Holt to make a choice he'd been hoping to avoid. In 2 weeks, the external assessment team would arrive, and by then, both Sofia and Graves would have built their cases, assembled their evidence, and prepared their arguments for why their approach represented the future of military training. Only one of them could be right, and the decision would reshape not just the Joint Training Program, but the trajectory of how the Navy prepared its operators for the kinds of wars that couldn't be won through overwhelming force alone. The base had split into 2 camps without realizing it yet. Those who valued innovation and those who valued stability. Those who thought the future required new thinking and those who thought new thinking was just old chaos wearing a fresh uniform. And standing in the middle of that division were 2 instructors, Sofia and Cross, who'd finally learned to work together, just in time to face an enemy neither of them had been training to fight. The final exercise was supposed to be a showcase. Admiral Holt had designed it as a capstone demonstration for the visiting assessment team, a way to illustrate how the Joint Training Program had evolved over 6 weeks. 3 scenarios running simultaneously across different sections of the base, each one designed to test different aspects of what the students had learned. Speed, discrimination, adaptation under pressure. Everything Sofia and Cross had been trying to integrate. But Commander Graves had other plans. The assessment team arrived on a gray Tuesday morning. 3 officers from Joint Special Operations Command, with credentials that suggested they'd seen more action than most people could imagine. A colonel named Patricia Vance led the group, her uniform bearing ribbons from Iraq, Afghanistan, and operations that remained classified even in official records. She carried herself with the kind of economy that marked real operators. No wasted movement, no performative displays of authority. Just competence wrapped in quiet observation. Graves had prepared meticulously. He'd compiled his documentation, organized it into a presentation that looked professional and objective, and scheduled a private briefing with the assessment team before they observed any actual training. That briefing happened in the secure conference room. Just Graves, his training oversight director Peters, and the 3 JSOC officers. Colonel Vance, "Thank you for taking time to evaluate our program," Graves began, his tone respectful but carrying an undertone of concern. "Before you observe today's exercises, I want to ensure you have complete context regarding some of the methodological choices that have been implemented." Vance's expression remained neutral. "We've reviewed the program overview. Are there specific concerns you want us to focus on?" "Not concerns exactly," Graves said carefully. "More questions about risk management and quality control." He activated the presentation on the conference room screen. "Commander Brennan has introduced innovative approaches, and innovation has value. But innovation without proper oversight can create liabilities." He walked them through his compiled evidence. The extended training window incident, The equipment checkout that bypassed standard approval. Student feedback mentioning discomfort during high-stress scenarios. Each item presented with professional detachment, framed as questions rather than accusations. Is this flexibility or negligence? Is this adaptive teaching or disregard for institutional safeguards? Peters added supporting commentary, his voice carrying practiced concern. We're not suggesting Commander Brennan is incompetent. Her credentials speak for themselves. But credentials don't exempt anyone from accountability. The question is whether her methods can be safely replicated by other instructors, or whether they're dependent on her personal expertise in ways that make them institutional liabilities. One of the junior assessment officers, a major named Torres, made notes on a tablet. The other, a Navy commander named Wei, asked a question. Have there been any actual safety incidents? Injuries, close calls, violations of established safety protocols? Nothing that's resulted in formal incident reports, Graves admitted. But absence of documented incidents isn't the same as absence of risk. In many cases, we've been fortunate that her judgment calls worked out. The question is what happens when they don't. Vance remained quiet throughout the presentation, her expression giving nothing away. When Graves finished, she looked at the screen displaying his final slide, a list of questions for assessment, then back at him. Commander Graves, I appreciate the thoroughness of this briefing, she said. We'll factor these considerations into our evaluation. But I want to be clear about something. We're not here to conduct a witch hunt. We're here to assess whether the integrated methodologies produce better operators. Everything else is secondary. Of course, Graves said smoothly. That's all any of us want. Better operators. The question is just how we define better and what risks we're willing to accept in pursuit of that definition. The meeting ended cordially and Graves felt satisfied. He'd planted seeds, raised legitimate questions, created a framework for viewing Sofia's methods through a lens of institutional risk. The assessment team would observe with those concerns in mind. And even if they didn't find overt problems, the questions would linger in their reports. What Graves didn't know was that Colonel Vance had worked with Sofia Brennan before. 6 years ago, in a classified operation in Yemen. She hadn't mentioned it in the briefing because she wanted to see how the base command framed Sofia's work before revealing her own perspective. And now, having heard Graves's presentation, Vance had a much clearer picture of the politics at play. The final exercise began at 1400 hours. All 24 students divided into 3 teams, each facing a different scenario in different facilities across the base. The assessment team split up to observe all 3 simultaneously, with Vance choosing to watch the most complex scenario, a hostage rescue in the urban warfare facility where Sofia and Cross would be jointly supervising. The scenario was deliberately chaotic. Multiple hostages, multiple hostiles, but with several twists. Some of the hostiles would attempt to surrender mid-operation. Some of the hostages would be armed and panicked. Communications would be intentionally degraded to simulate equipment failure. Time pressure would be real, but not artificial. The scenario would adapt based on student decisions rather than following a fixed script. Sofia and Cross stood in the control booth, overlooking the facility. Between them, the tension from their early conflicts had transformed into something closer to partnership. They'd planned this scenario together, argued over details, compromised on approaches, and ultimately created something neither of them could have designed alone. Your students are going to hit hard and fast, Sofia said quietly, watching the teams prepare in the staging area below. Yours are going to assess every angle and risk overthinking. Cross replied. So the question is whether they've learned to pull from both approaches, Sofia said, or whether they default to what feels safe when pressure hits. Cross agreed. Colonel Vance stood behind them, observing not just the scenario but the instructors themselves. The way they communicated in shorthand, the way they'd learned each other's patterns, the mutual respect that had replaced their initial friction. This, she thought, was what evolution looked like in military training. Not one approach replacing another, but approaches learning to coexist and strengthen each other. The exercise began with a breach. Team Alpha, led by Lieutenant Vickers, moved with decisive speed, but paused at critical junctures. When they encountered the first armed individual, a role player instructed to behave ambiguously, they didn't immediately fire. Instead, Vickers used verbal commands while his team maintained coverage. Buying 2 seconds of assessment that revealed the person was a hostage who'd grabbed a weapon in panic. Not a hostile. Good, Cross muttered, watching the screen. They're keeping momentum but adding discrimination. Team Bravo, led by Agent Rhodes, hit a complication when their communication system failed as designed. Instead of pushing forward blindly or freezing in confusion, they adapted, using hand signals and adjusting their formation to maintain coordination without radio contact. When they located the primary hostages, they found 2 had been zip-tied by the hostiles, but one was actually a hostile pretending to be a victim. Rhodes caught it. Something in the body language, the way the person's eyes tracked her team's positions rather than seeking rescue. She made a call, separated that individual from the others, and discovered a concealed weapon. Potential disaster avoided through observation rather than assumption. That's the integration we've been building, Sofia said quietly. Speed with awareness. Action with assessment. Team Charlie faced the hardest scenario. Mid-extraction, several hostiles attempted to surrender, dropping weapons and raising hands. But the scenario was designed with a second layer. One of them was stalling, buying time for others to reposition. The students had to decide whether to accept the surrender, secure the surrendering individuals and risk losing momentum, or maintain offensive pressure and risk violating rules of engagement. Petty Officer Nash, leading Charlie team, made a split-second call. He assigned 2 operators to secure the surrendering hostiles while the rest of the team maintained forward movement. It cost them 15 seconds, but it prevented both a rules of engagement violation and a tactical surprise from the repositioning hostiles. All 3 teams completed their objectives with no casualties, minimal rule violations, and demonstrated ability to adapt under pressure. The execution wasn't perfect. There were moments of hesitation, moments of excessive aggression, communication breakdowns that created temporary chaos. But overall, the performance represented exactly what the training program had been designed to produce. Operators who could balance competing priorities under stress. As the students cleared the facility and moved to the debrief area, Colonel Vance turned to Sofia and Cross. Impressive, she said simply. Both the scenario design and the student performance. How long ago did you start integrating your methodologies? About 4 weeks, Cross said. First 3 weeks were rocky. We spent most of that time arguing, Sofia added with a slight smile. But you worked it out, Vance said. Why? Sofia and Cross exchanged a glance. Cross answered first. Because neither approach was complete on its own. My methods produced decisive operators. But decisiveness without discrimination creates predictable patterns and unnecessary casualties. Her methods produced thoughtful operators. But thoughtfulness without decisiveness creates paralysis under pressure. Together, they produce something better than either one alone. And you, Vance said, turning to Sofia. You're comfortable operating within institutional structures now? Following protocols and approval processes? It was a pointed question, one that suggested Vance knew about Graves's concerns. Sofia met her eyes directly. I'm comfortable operating within structures that serve the mission, Sofia said carefully. When protocols enhance effectiveness, I follow them religiously. When they obstruct effectiveness, I work to change them through proper channels. And in rare cases where neither option is viable, I make judgment calls and accept accountability for those calls. which is another way of saying you don't always follow the rules. Vance observed, which is another way of saying I prioritize the mission over institutional convenience, Sofia corrected. Every operator in that facility just demonstrated the ability to adapt when circumstances don't match their training templates. That's what I teach. If we train people to only function within rigid structures, we're preparing them for wars that don't exist anymore. Vance was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. Colonel Cross, would you mind giving Commander Brennan and me a few minutes alone? Cross glanced at Sofia, who gave him a slight nod, then left the control booth. When they were alone, Vance's professional demeanor softened slightly. Yemen, 2019, she said. Joint Task Force Operation. You were the psychological operations advisor who talked a warlord's second-in-command into defecting mid-operation. Changed the entire trajectory of the mission without firing a shot. Sofia's expression shifted with recognition. You were the ground force commander. Lieutenant Colonel Vance then. That's right, Vance confirmed. I've spent 6 years since then trying to get people to understand what you did in that tent. How you turned a potential massacre into a strategic victory through nothing but presence and psychological leverage. Most people think it was luck or charisma. But I was there. I saw you prepare for that conversation. The breath control, the situational awareness, the ability to read micro-expressions and adjust in real time. That wasn't luck. That was a skill set most operators don't even know exists. Why are you telling me this? Sofia asked. Because Commander Graves briefed me this morning, Vance said bluntly. Spent an hour raising concerns about your methods. Protocol violations, risk management issues, questions about whether your approaches can be institutionalized. She paused. He's building a case to have you removed from the program. Sofia absorbed that without visible reaction. What did you tell him? I told him we'd assess objectively, Vance said. Which I will. But I wanted you to know what you're dealing with. Graves isn't wrong that you operate outside conventional structures. And in a peacetime military focused on institutional preservation, that makes you threatening. The question is whether the threat you represent to bureaucratic comfort is worth more than the value you add to operational effectiveness. And what's your assessment? Sofia asked. Vance looked through the observation window at the students gathered in the debrief area below, still energized from the exercise, discussing their decisions and alternatives with the kind of engaged analysis that suggested real learning had occurred. My assessment, Vance said slowly, is that you're teaching the thing we need most and understand least. How to operate in the gray zones where traditional tactics fail. How to win without overwhelming force. How to make good decisions when all the options are bad. She turned back to Sofia. But teaching that requires you to exist in those same gray zones yourself. And institutions don't like gray zones. They like clear lines, established protocols, measurable outcomes. So what happens now? Sofia asked. Now we've finished the assessment, Vance said. We observe the debriefs, interview students and instructors, review the documentation Graves has compiled. Then we write a report that will either validate your methods or recommend significant restrictions on how you operate. She paused. For what it's worth, I'm going to recommend validation. But I'm one voice on a 3-person team, and the other 2 haven't worked with you before. They're going to weigh the institutional concerns heavily. Sofia nodded slowly. Then I'll make sure the debrief gives them clear evidence of why these methods matter. The debrief lasted 90 minutes. Sofia and Cross walked the students through each scenario, highlighting good decisions, analyzing mistakes, pushing them to articulate the reasoning behind their choices. The assessment team observed, asked occasional questions, and took extensive notes. By the time it ended, the students were exhausted but energized. The kind of exhaustion that comes from real learning rather than just physical exertion. They dispersed slowly, still talking among themselves. Processing the experience, Commander Graves, who'd been watching from a distance, approached Colonel Vance as the assessment team prepared to leave the facility. "Colonel, I hope today's exercise gave you useful data," he said. "Though I'd encourage you to also consider what happens when scenarios don't go this smoothly. When the judgment calls don't work out." Vance gave him a long look. "Commander Graves, I've spent 23 years in special operations. I've seen what happens when training prepares people for textbook scenarios and reality delivers chaos. I've carried operators out of buildings because they froze when the situation didn't match their templates." She gestured toward the facility where the exercise had just concluded. "What I saw today was the opposite of that. I saw students who'd been taught to think, not just react. To assess, not just execute. That's not a liability. That's the future." Graves's jaw tightened. "With respect, Colonel, the future still has to operate within institutional frameworks. Innovation without structure is just anarchy." "Maybe," Vance said. "Or maybe the frameworks need to evolve to accommodate innovation. That's what we're here to figure out." She walked away, leaving Graves standing alone, watching Sofia and Cross confer quietly near the control booth. He'd made his case, compiled his evidence, raised legitimate institutional concerns, but he was beginning to realize that legitimacy wasn't the same as righteousness. And that sometimes, the people who protected institutions ended up protecting the wrong things. The assessment team would deliver their report in 72 hours. And whatever that report said would determine not just Sofia's future at Naval Station Cascade, but the direction of military training philosophy for years to come. The question wasn't just whether Sofia's methods worked. Everyone had seen that they did. The question was whether an institution built on rigid structures could evolve to embrace approaches that existed in the spaces between those structures. And whether Commander Graves could accept that evolution, or whether he'd fight it all the way to the end. The assessment report was scheduled to be delivered on Friday morning. But late Thursday night, something happened that rendered the entire evaluation process suddenly irrelevant. Sofia had stayed late at the base, working in her small office on documentation for a new training module she'd been developing. It was past 2,200 hours, the administrative building mostly empty except for the overnight duty staff. She was reviewing video footage from the day's exercises when her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from a contact she hadn't heard from in 6 months. The message was short. "Cascade has a problem. Check your secure email now." Sofia's expression shifted immediately from fatigue to focused attention. She logged into her classified email account through the secure terminal in her office, entering the multiple authentication layers required for access. The message waiting for her came from Naval Criminal Investigative Service, marked urgent and containing 3 attached files. She opened them in sequence, her face remaining neutral but her jaw tightening with each paragraph she read. The first file detailed an ongoing investigation into weapons smuggling through Pacific Northwest naval facilities. Significant quantities of small arms, ammunition, and tactical equipment had been disappearing from inventory systems across multiple bases over the past 18 months. The thefts were sophisticated, exploiting gaps in tracking systems during transfers between facilities and training exercises. The second file contained intercepted communication suggesting Naval Station Cascade was a primary node in the smuggling network. Equipment was being diverted during training exercises, marked as expended or damaged, then rerouted through civilian contractors with ties to organized crime syndicates. The third file was the reason NCIS had contacted Sofia specifically. They had identified a base officer as a person of interest in the investigation, someone with access to training schedules, equipment requisitions, and enough authority to authorize irregular transactions without triggering immediate oversight. The officer's name was Lieutenant Commander Nathan Peters. Commander Graves's training oversight director. Sofia read through the evidence twice, her mind already working through implications and connections. Peters had been instrumental in documenting concerns about her training methods, had compiled the evidence Graves presented to the assessment team. At the time, she'd assumed it was just bureaucratic friction. Now she saw it differently. If Peters was involved in smuggling operations, then scrutinizing her unorthodox training methods served a dual purpose. It created institutional conflict that distracted from his activities, and it established him as someone concerned with protocol and accountability. The perfect cover for someone systematically violating both. The NCIS message included a request: "We're moving to arrest within 48 hours. Need your operational assessment of base security protocols and potential risks during apprehension. Also need discretion. If Peters suspects investigation, evidence could be destroyed and network actors could scatter." Sofia composed a response outlining what she knew about base security patterns, blind spots in surveillance coverage, and the best times for low-visibility operations. She also flagged something that concerned her. Peters had authorization to access the armory overnight for training preparation purposes. If he suspected anything, he could potentially arm himself or destroy evidence before NCIS could execute their operation. She sent the response, then sat in the quiet office considering her next move. Protocol said she should inform Admiral Holt immediately, but NCIS had specifically requested discretion, and Holt's communication with his senior staff was documented through official channels. Any warning to Holt might inadvertently tip off Peters if he had access to communication logs. The alternative was to do nothing, wait for NCIS to handle their operation, and trust that federal law enforcement could manage the situation without base involvement. But Sofia had been in enough operations to know that plans fell apart the moment they encountered reality. If something went wrong during the arrest, if Peters decided to escalate rather than surrender quietly, the base could find itself dealing with an armed hostile who knew every inch of the facility and had access to weapon systems. She was still weighing options when her phone rang. Not her personal cell, but the secure line that only a handful of people had access to. She answered on the second ring. "Brennan. Commander, this is Colonel Vance. I apologize for the late call. Are you somewhere you can speak freely?" Sofia glanced around her empty office. "Affirmative. NCIS contacted me an hour ago," Vance said. "Briefed me on the Peters investigation. They wanted operational perspective on arrest logistics. I assume they contacted you as well?" "They did," Sofia confirmed. "Then you know we have a timing problem," Vance said. "Peters is scheduled to brief my assessment team tomorrow morning at 0800. If we let that proceed normally, we maintain his routine and reduce suspicion. But it also means we have federal investigators visiting JSOC officers and a smuggling suspect in the same room. That's not a scenario I'm comfortable with." "What's NCIS proposing?" Sofia asked. "They want to accelerate the timeline. Execute the arrest tonight, 0300 hours, when Peters typically leaves the base after completing overnight inventory checks. Intercept him at the main gate, minimal visibility, no opportunity for escalation." Vance paused. "But they're concerned about his access to weapons and his knowledge of base security. They want operational support from someone who knows the facility and can move quickly if things go wrong." Sofia understood what was being asked. "You want me on standby during the arrest. I want you positioned with a small team where you can respond if Peters doesn't go quietly," Vance corrected. "NCIS will handle the actual apprehension. But if he runs, if he barricades himself somewhere, if he tries to access the armory, I need someone who can intervene before this turns into a hostage situation or active shooter scenario." It was a reasonable request, and it aligned with Sofia's own concerns. But it also meant operating completely outside the chain of command. Conducting a security operation without informing the base commander or executive officer. What does Admiral Holt know? Sofia asked. Nothing yet, Vance admitted. And CIS wants to brief him immediately after Peters is in custody. They're concerned about communication security if we read him in beforehand. Sofia was quiet for a moment, considering the ethics and risks. Then she made her decision. I'll need Cross if we're setting up a response team. I want someone who knows aggressive tactics as well as I know containment. And I'll need authorization to brief him on the situation. You have it, Vance said. NCIS is sending a secure briefing package to both of you within the next 30 minutes. Assembly point is the training operations building at 0230 hours. We'll have 3 NCIS agents, plus whatever small team you and Cross can quietly assemble. Understood, Sofia said. Colonel, one question. The assessment report. Is this going to affect the evaluation? Vance was silent for a beat. Commander, if everything goes smoothly tonight, my report was going to recommend full integration of your methodologies into standard training curricula. This situation doesn't change that. If anything, it reinforces why we need operators who can handle complexity and ambiguity. She paused. But let's focus on tonight first. We can worry about bureaucratic validation after we've arrested a smuggler and secured the base. They disconnected. And Sofia immediately called Cross. He answered after 3 rings, his voice alert despite the late hour. She gave him the abbreviated version, enough to get him moving without compromising NCIS operational security. My office in 15 minutes, she said. Bring gear for a potential containment operation. This is not a drill, and it's not official. And I need you to trust me. On my way, Cross said without hesitation, 20 minutes later. They sat in Sofia's office reviewing the NCIS briefing package on her secure terminal. Cross read through the evidence in silence, his expression growing darker with each page. Peters, he said finally. That smug bureaucrat has been stealing from us while filing paperwork questioning your protocol compliance. That's almost impressive in its hypocrisy. Focus, Sofia said. NCIS wants him at 0300 at the main gate. But if something spooks him beforehand, if he decides to run early or hole up somewhere, we need response options. Cross pulled up a base map on the terminal. His office is here, in the administration building. Armory is here. His quarters are in the officer housing section. If he runs, those are his most likely locations. Armory gives him weapons, his office gives him data and potential evidence to destroy. His quarters give him familiarity and defensive position. We can't cover all 3 with just us, Sofia said. We need at least 4 more people. But they need to be people we trust absolutely, and we can't explain the full situation without compromising NCIS operational security. Tell them it's a security drill, Cross suggested. Unannounced readiness test. We've done those before. Nobody will question it, and if nothing happens, nobody needs to know it was real. Sofia nodded. Get Vickers, Rhodes, Nash, and Torres. Tell them to meet us at the training operations building at 0230 full tactical gear, live rounds. Tell them it's a surprise evaluation exercise for command readiness certification. They're going to figure out it's real when they see NCIS agents. Cross pointed out. By then it'll be too late to ask questions, Sofia said. And all 4 of them have clearances high enough that we can read them in, if necessary. Cross made the calls while Sofia reviewed Peters's recent activity logs, looking for patterns. He'd been working late most nights this week, supposedly preparing documentation for the assessment team. But his computer access logs showed him pulling inventory files, reviewing equipment transfer records, cross-referencing training schedules with shipping manifests. Exactly the kind of access someone would need to coordinate smuggling operations. She also found something else. 2 days ago, Peters had accessed the classified section of her personnel file. The one that detailed her previous work with NCIS on a counterintelligence operation 3 years ago. He'd looked at it for 7 minutes, then immediately accessed secure communication logs to see who she'd been in contact with recently. "He knows," Sofia said quietly. Cross looked up from his phone. "What?" "Peters knows he's under investigation. Or at least suspects it. He accessed my file, saw my NCIS connection history, probably put together that I might be involved in whatever's happening." She pointed at the access logs. "This was 2 days ago. He's been preparing. Then why hasn't he run?" Cross asked. "Because running confirms guilt," Sofia said. "If he's smart, and he is, he's been setting up contingencies while maintaining his normal routine. Insurance policies, evidence caches, maybe even dead man switches that release information if he's arrested." She pulled up another screen. "Look at his access pattern over the past 48 hours. He's been systematically reviewing files related to base security, personnel rosters, command communications. He's mapping potential threats and vulnerabilities." Cross leaned back in his chair. "So we're not just preventing him from running. We're trying to arrest someone who's been preparing for exactly this scenario. Which means the 0300 arrest at the main gate might not go as smoothly as NCIS hopes," Sofia said. "They spent the next 2 hours wargaming scenarios and preparing contingencies. By 0230, when they assembled in the training operations building with the 4 students and 3 NCIS agents, Sofia had a tactical plan that covered 17 different ways Peters might react, and responses for each. Lieutenant Vickers was the first to realize something was wrong. He'd shown up as instructed, but the moment he saw the NCIS agents in tactical gear, his expression shifted from confusion to focused attention. "This isn't a drill," he said quietly. "No," Sofia confirmed. "It's not. And I can't tell you everything yet. But I need you and your team ready to respond to a potential security situation in approximately 30 minutes. Can you do that without knowing the full context?" Vickers looked at Rhodes, Nash, and Torres. Something passed between them, a silent communication built over weeks of training together. Then Vickers nodded. "We trust you, ma'am. Whatever's happening, we're ready." Sofia felt something tighten in her chest. Trust like that was earned slowly and lost instantly. She was asking these students to operate on faith, to potentially put themselves at risk for a situation she couldn't fully explain. It was exactly the kind of gray zone operation that institutional protocols were designed to prevent. It was also exactly the kind of situation that required the methods she'd been teaching. The senior NCIS agent, a hard-eyed woman named Reyes, briefed the group on the basics. Arrest operation, potential for resistance, need for secure containment if the target attempted to flee or barricade. She didn't mention Peters by name, didn't reveal the smuggling investigation, just provided enough tactical context to prepare them. At 0250 hours, they moved into position. NCIS took the main gate approach. Sofia and Cross positioned themselves with the student team near the administration building, where they could respond to any of Peters's likely fallback positions. At 0255, Sofia's radio crackled with a message from the overnight duty officer. "Commander Brennan, we have a situation. Lieutenant Commander Peters just accessed the armory using his emergency authorization code. He signed out 2 M4 carbines, 6 magazines of ammunition, and a tactical vest." When the armory officer asked about the requisition, Peters said it was for an early morning training exercise you'd authorized. Sofia and Cross locked eyes. "He knows," Cross said. Sofia keyed her radio. "All units, target is in the armory and is now armed. This is no longer a simple apprehension. Reyes, do you want to abort?" There was a pause, then Reyes's voice came back, calm and professional. Negative. We proceed. But this just became a tactical situation instead of an arrest. Brennan, you have operational command for containment. NCIS will provide support and legal authority. Bring him in alive if possible. Sofia took a breath, feeling the familiar shift into operational mode. The place where training became reality, where theory met consequence. Cross, take Vickers and Nash. Cover the armory exits. Non-lethal engagement if possible, but protect yourselves. Rhodes, Torres with me. We're going to his office. If he grabbed weapons, he's probably going to grab data next. They moved through the dark base like shadows, years of training making them nearly silent despite the urgency. As they approached the administration building, Sofia saw a light on in Peters's third-floor office. He was already there, and whatever happened next would test everything she'd taught about operating. In the spaces where doctrine didn't have answers, the administration building felt different at night. The fluorescent lights that normally hummed with institutional authority were dimmed to emergency levels, casting long shadows that turned familiar hallways into something foreign. Sofia moved through them with Rhodes and Torres flanking her, their footsteps silent on polished floors that smelled of cleaning solution and old coffee dot through her earpiece. She heard Cross's voice, low and controlled. Armory exit secure. No movement. Either he's still inside or he slipped out before we got here. He's not in the armory, Sofia replied quietly, her eyes tracking the light still visible in Peters's third-floor office window. He's up here, 3 Alpha 7. Lights on, blinds partially closed. Want us to move up? Cross asked. Negative. Hold position. If he runs, he'll go down, not up. Be ready. Sofia paused at the stairwell entrance, listening. No sounds of movement above. She gestured to Rhodes and Torres, then started climbing, her movements economical and measured. Each footfall placed deliberately, weight distributed to minimize sound. Behind her, Rhodes and Torres mirrored her rhythm. They reached the third floor, and Sofia held up a fist, stopping them in the stairwell. Through the small window in the fire door, she could see down the hallway toward Peters's office. The door was closed, light leaking from the gap underneath. No movement visible, no sounds audible. She keyed her radio again. Reyes, what's your status? NCIS is mobilizing the negotiation team, Reyes replied. ETA 15 minutes. Do you have containment? Affirmative. Target is in his office, third-floor administration building. Armed with at least 2 M4 South and unknown quantity of ammunition. Recommend you also mobilize medical. I don't know how this ends yet. Copy that. Brennan, hold position and maintain containment until negotiators arrive. Do not engage unless he attempts to harm himself or others. Standard protocol. Safe protocol. The kind of by-the-book approach that minimized risk and maximized accountability. Sofia acknowledged the instruction, then continued watching Peters's office door, her mind working through alternative scenarios. 15 minutes was a long time. Long enough for Peters to destroy evidence, to make calls to accomplices outside the base, to set up defensive positions that would make eventual entry more dangerous. Long enough for him to spiral, for whatever calculations he'd been making to shift from escape to desperation. She'd been in situations like this before. Watched containment turn into standoff, watched standoff turn into tragedy, because everyone followed protocol and nobody read the room. Rhodes, Torres, she said quietly, I need you to understand something. I'm about to do something that's not in the playbook. You can stay here, maintain position, follow NCIS instructions. Nobody will question that. Or you can come with me and trust that I know what I'm doing. Either way is valid. Rhodes's response was immediate. We're with you, ma'am. Torres nodded agreement. Sofia felt that tightness in her chest again. The weight of responsibility. The knowledge that if this went wrong, These 2 young operators would pay for her judgment call. But she'd spent 6 weeks teaching them to operate in gray zones, to make hard calls when doctrine didn't have answers. Time to show them what that actually looked like. She moved to the fire door, opened it slowly, and stepped into the hallway. No attempt at stealth now. She walked directly toward Peters's office, her footsteps audible, her posture relaxed. Rhodes and Torres followed at a distance, providing coverage but not aggressive posture. When she reached Peters's door, she knocked. 3 times, firm but not threatening. The light under the door flickered as someone moved inside. Then silence. "Commander Peters," Sofia said, her voice carrying clearly through the door, but not loud enough to echo through the building. "It's Commander Brennan. I know you're in there. I know you're armed. I know why. Can we talk?" More silence. Then Peters's voice, muffled by the door, but audible. "I don't think there's much to talk about, Commander. I suspect you're not here for a philosophical discussion about operational ethics." Sofia noted the tone. Not panicked. Not aggressive. Resigned, maybe. Or calculating. "Actually, that's exactly why I'm here. Open the door. Let's have the conversation. With NCIS agents in the building? With your tactical team positioned at every exit? Forgive me if I don't believe this is just a conversation." "You're right," Sofia said. "This is an arrest operation. NCIS has evidence of your involvement in weapons smuggling. They're going to take you into custody tonight, whether we have this conversation or not. The only question is how that happens. So you're offering me what? A chance to surrender peacefully? To make it easier for everyone?" "I'm offering you a chance to control your own narrative," Sofia said. "Right now, you're the corrupt officer who stole from his command, who betrayed his oath for profit. That's the story NCIS is building. But stories have context, motivations, circumstances. If you come out and talk to me, you get to provide that context before the investigators start assembling their version." Another pause. Sofia could hear movement inside the office. Footsteps. The sound of something being moved. Maybe furniture being repositioned. He was creating defensive space, preparing for potential breach. The window of de-escalation was closing. He walked away, leaving Sofia and Cross standing in the pre-dawn darkness with their students, all of them processing the gap between training scenarios and actual operations. Vickers spoke first. "Ma'am, that was the most intense not a drill I've ever experienced." "Welcome to the gray zones," Sofia said, "where protocol gives you frameworks but not answers, and you have to trust your judgment even when you can't be certain you're right. How do you know when to trust your judgment?" Nash asked. Sofia looked. At the administration building, at the office where Peters had been preparing to either surrender or escalate, at the space where judgment had determined whether the night ended peacefully or violently. "You never know for certain," she said quietly. "You train, you prepare, you practice reading situations until it becomes instinct, and then you make the call and accept the consequences. That's the job. That's what we're teaching you to do." The assessment report, when it finally came 48 hours later, recommended full integration of Sofia's methodologies into standard training curricula. But by then, nobody cared much about bureaucratic validation. They'd all seen what mattered. Not whether methods followed protocol, but whether they produced operators who could handle reality when it refused to match the textbook. The base felt different in the weeks following Peters's arrest. Not quieter, exactly, the rhythms of training. And operations continued as they always had, but there was a subtle shift in how people moved through those rhythms. More awareness, more questions. Less certainty that the systems everyone trusted were actually trustworthy. Commander Graves had become a ghost of his former authority. With Peters gone, and the smuggling investigation expanding to examine how oversight failures had enabled the operation, Graves found himself under scrutiny he couldn't deflect. He hadn't been implicated in the smuggling itself, but his insistence on bureaucratic rigidity over operational awareness had created the perfect environment for Peters to operate undetected. Within 2 weeks, he'd requested transfer to a desk position at Pacific Fleet Headquarters. Within 3, he was gone. The joint training program continued under Admiral Holt's direct supervision, with Sofia and Cross now officially designated as co-directors. The distinction was more than titular. It represented institutional acknowledgement that the future of tactical training required integration of approaches that had previously been seen as contradictory. Sofia stood in the briefing room on a Thursday afternoon in early December, 6 weeks removed from the jewelry store incident that had started everything. She was conducting the final evaluation session for the program's inaugural class, the same 24 students who'd spent 8 weeks learning to balance speed with assessment, aggression with discrimination, doctrine with adaptation. Over the past 2 months, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. You've been taught competing philosophies. Senior Chief Cross taught you to trust your training, to act decisively, to overwhelm threats with speed and violence of action. I taught you to observe, to assess, to find stillness in chaos. Some of you probably spent weeks wondering which approach was right. She paused, scanning the faces looking back at her. Vickers, Rhodes, Nash Torres, and 24 others who'd entered this program as skilled operators and were leaving as something more nuanced. The answer, she continued, is that both are right, and neither is sufficient alone. Real operations don't wait for you to decide which methodology applies. They throw everything at you simultaneously and demand that you respond with whatever tool the moment requires. The question isn't whether you know how to breach fast or assess carefully. The question is whether you can read the situation accurately enough to know which response it demands. Cross stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, nodding slightly. 6 weeks ago, he would have bristled at that framing, would have argued that decisiveness was always the right answer. Now he understood that decisiveness and assessment weren't opposites. They were aspects of the same competency. You're going to leave here and return to your units, Sofia said. Some of you will face commanders who want everything done by the book. Others will face situations where the book doesn't have answers. All of you will face moments where you have to choose between competing priorities with insufficient information and no time to deliberate. That's not a failure of training. That's the nature of the profession you've chosen. She walked to the front of the room where a whiteboard displayed the mantra that had become central to the program. Control is command. Panic is permission. This phrase has been repeated so often over the past 8 weeks that some of you probably see it in your sleep, she said. But I want to make sure you understand what it actually means. It's not about suppressing fear or eliminating emotional response. It's about refusing to let fear make your decisions. About maintaining agency even when everything around you is chaos. Agent Rhodes raised her hand. Ma'am, during the Peters situation, you violated direct orders to maintain containment. You approached an armed suspect without backup, without tactical support, based entirely on your read of the situation. How do we know when it's appropriate to make that kind of judgment call versus when we should follow protocol? It was a fair question, the kind that didn't have easy answers. You never know with certainty, Sofia said honestly. But you develop judgment through experience, through studying situations that went wrong and understanding why, through practicing decision-making in increasingly complex scenarios. In the Peters situation, I assessed that he was more scared than dangerous, more desperate for control over his narrative than committed to violent resistance. I could have been wrong. If I'd been wrong, people could have died, including me. But I believe the risk of intervention was lower than the risk of containment failure during an extended standoff. And if you had been wrong, Rhodes pressed, if he'd opened fire when you approached, then I would have been shot, Sofia said simply. And you and Torres would have responded according to your training, and Peters would have been killed or captured. And we'd be having a very different conversation about whether my judgment call was justified. She paused. The job doesn't come with guarantees. It comes with training, experience, and the requirement that you make the best decision you can with the information available. Sometimes that decision is to follow protocol because protocol has been proven effective. Sometimes it's to deviate from protocol because the situation demands adaptation. Learning to distinguish between those moments is the skill we've been building. Lieutenant Vickers spoke up from the middle of the room. It seems like what you're really teaching is comfort with uncertainty, with not knowing if you're making the right call until after it's done. That's exactly what I'm teaching, Sofia confirmed. Because that's the reality you're going to face. Every operation, every crisis, every moment that matters, you'll be making decisions with incomplete information under time pressure. Operators who freeze are the ones who need certainty before they act. The operators who thrive are the ones who accept uncertainty and act anyway, then adapt based on outcomes. Cross moved forward to stand beside Sofia. His presence shifted the energy in the room. Two philosophies that had learned to coexist now presenting as unified perspective. Commander Brennan and I spent the first 3 weeks of this program arguing, he said. About methods, about priorities, about what makes an effective operator. We both thought we were right and the other was wrong. Turns out we were both right and both wrong. My approach produces decisive action. Hers produces thoughtful assessment. Real excellence requires both. He gestured to the students. You've all seen both sides now. You've run scenarios where speed saved lives and scenarios where speed killed civilians. You've experienced situations where assessment prevented disasters and situations where assessment created paralysis. The goal isn't to pick one approach and commit to it. The goal is to internalize both so deeply that they become reflexive. So you can draw on either one depending on what the moment requires. The room was silent, students processing the integration of concepts that had seemed contradictory weeks ago, but now felt like different aspects of the same skill set. Sofia checked her watch. You have your final evaluations tomorrow morning. 3 scenarios, designed to test everything you've learned. After that, you're done. You'll return to your units with certificates of completion and recommendations for your commands. But more importantly, you'll return with a different way of thinking about your profession. A way that embraces complexity instead of avoiding it. Commander Peters, she said, shifting her tone slightly, dropping the formal edge and adding something more personal. I've read your service record. 12 years, multiple deployments. Commendations for logistics excellence in hostile environments. You're not a criminal who happened to wear a uniform. You're a decorated officer who made bad choices. Those are different things. But only if you're willing to acknowledge that difference. You don't know anything about my choices, Peters shot back. And now there was heat in his voice. Defensiveness. You show up here with your unconventional methods and your special reputation. And suddenly, everyone acts like the way we've been doing things for decades is wrong. You have any idea how much work it takes to keep a base like this running? How many compromises happen behind the scenes to make sure operators have what they need? Is that what this was? Sofia asked. Compromises to support the mission? It started that way, Peters said, and his voice had shifted again, quieter now, almost confessional. Budget cuts, procurement delays, equipment shortages. I found ways to get around the bureaucracy. Unofficial channels that delivered what official ones couldn't. And yes, I took compensation for facilitating those channels. But it wasn't about greed. It was about keeping operators equipped. Until it was about greed, Sofia said, not accusatory, just observational. Until the justifications became rationalizations, and the unofficial channels became smuggling operations. Silence. The kind that feels like acknowledgement. How did you know? Peters asked finally. I didn't, Sofia admitted. NCIS approached me tonight with their evidence. But looking back, I should have seen the pattern. The way you've been documenting concerns about my methods, building cases for greater oversight. It wasn't about quality control. It was about creating noise, distracting attention from your activities, by focusing command scrutiny on someone else. Can you blame me? Peters's voice carried bitter amusement now. You're the perfect distraction. The innovative instructor who doesn't follow rules, who operates outside standard protocols. Graves was so focused on containing you that nobody was looking at logistics irregularities. Except NCIS was looking, Sofia said. And they've been watching for months. The question now is what happens next. You can barricade yourself in that office, force a tactical entry, maybe get yourself killed in the process. That's one ending. Or you can open this door, we can walk downstairs together, and you can start controlling your own narrative before investigators write it for you. And if I believe NCIS will be fair, that they'll consider context and circumstances, I can't promise fairness, Sofia said honestly. I can promise that surrendering peacefully gives you better odds than the alternative. And I can promise that if you come out now, I'll make sure your service record is part of the conversation. That people remember you were a good officer before you were a compromised one. She heard him moving again. Closer to the door this time. She gestured subtly to Rhodes and Torres, indicating they should lower their weapons slightly, reduce the aggressive posture. Show Peters that walking out didn't mean walking into a firing line. The door handle turned slowly. The door opened 6 inches, and Peters's face appeared in the gap. He looked older than his 43 years, exhaustion and stress carved into lines around his eyes. He was holding an M4, but it was pointed at the floor, finger outside the trigger guard. If I do this, he said, if I come out peacefully, I want your word that nobody gets hurt. Not me, not your team, not anyone. This ends quietly. You have my word, Sofia said. Lower the weapon, step out, hands visible. We'll walk downstairs together, and NCIS will take custody. No drama, no escalation. Peters studied her face, searching for deception or hidden agenda. Finding neither, he nodded slowly. Your reputation is that you don't lie. That your word is absolute. I'm trusting that's true. It is, Sofia said simply. Peters opened the door fully. He was wearing the tactical vest he'd taken from the armory, loaded with magazines. The M4 was slung across his chest. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for the sling release, detached the weapon, and set it on the floor inside his office. Then he removed the tactical vest and set it beside the rifle. There's a Sig Sauer on my hip, he said. I'm going to remove it with 2 fingers, place it on the ground, and kick it toward you. Then I'll step out with my hands visible. Appreciated, Sofia said, maintaining her calm tone even as her nervous system tracked every movement. Ready to respond if his actions shifted from compliance to threat, Peters did exactly as he described. The pistol slid across the hallway floor, stopping near Rhodes's feet. Then Peters stepped out of his office, hands raised to shoulder level, palms visible. Sofia keyed her radio. All units, target has surrendered peacefully. We're walking him out. Reyes, have your team meet us at the main entrance. She moved forward, positioning herself beside Peters rather than behind him. Not a guard escorting a prisoner, but 2 officers walking together. It was a subtle distinction, but Peters noticed. Some of the tension left his shoulders. They walked through the building in silence. Rhodes and Torres maintaining tactical positions, but with weapons lowered. When they reached the main entrance, NCIS agents were waiting with restraints. Peters allowed himself to be handcuffed without resistance, his expression neutral. Defeated but not broken dot as the agents led him toward their vehicle. Peters looked back at Sofia. For what it's worth. Commander, your methods are better than mine. I built systems that looked good on paper but failed in practice. You build people who adapt when systems fail. That's more valuable. I just wish I'd understood that before I tried to tear you down." Sofia nodded once, acknowledging but not accepting the apology. Peters had betrayed his oath, stolen from his command, endangered the mission he'd sworn to protect. Context didn't erase that. But understanding context mattered for what came next. Reyes approached Sofia as the NCIS vehicle pulled away. "That was good work, Commander. Textbook de-escalation. You probably saved his life tonight." "Just following training," Sofia said quietly. "Read the situation, adapt to circumstances, find the path with minimum casualties. Same principles I teach every day." "Still," Reyes said, "not everyone would have taken the risk of approaching him directly." "Standard protocol said wait for negotiators." "Standard protocol would have turned this into a 6-hour standoff," Sofia replied. "Peters is smart enough to know he was caught, but scared enough to make bad decisions if given too much time to think. Better to compress the timeline, force a choice before fear took over." Cross emerged from the building with his team, his expression unreadable. When he reached Sofia, he spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "You violated direct orders from NCIS to maintain containment and wait for negotiators." "I did," Sofia acknowledged. "Could have gotten yourself killed. Could have gotten Rhodes and Torres killed. Could have turned a smuggling arrest into a hostage situation or active shooter scenario. Could have," Sofia agreed. Cross was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled slightly. "Good call. Sometimes the book is wrong, and you have to trust your read of the situation. That's what you've been teaching us all along." Admiral Holt arrived 20 minutes later, hastily dressed. His expression cycling between shock and anger as Reyes briefed him on Peters's arrest and the evidence of smuggling operations. When he'd absorbed the basics, he turned to Sofia and, "Cross, you two coordinated a tactical response to an active threat on my base without informing me," he said flatly. "NCIS requested operational discretion due to communication security concerns," Sofia replied. By the time the situation escalated to armed confrontation, there wasn't time for formal authorization. "That's a diplomatic way of saying you made a command decision without command authority," Holt said. "Yes, sir," Sofia acknowledged. "I judged that immediate response outweighed procedural compliance. If that judgment was wrong, I accept full responsibility and consequences." Holt studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at Cross. "You agreed with this approach?" "I did, sir," Cross said. "Commander Brennan's tactical assessment was sound. The outcome validates her decision-making." "The outcome," Holt said slowly, "is that we just arrested my training oversight director for federal crimes, exposed a smuggling network operating through my base, and conducted a tactical operation that could have resulted in casualties or a public relations disaster." He paused. "But everyone's alive, the suspect is in custody, and we prevented potential evidence destruction. So I'm going to file this under questionable methods, acceptable results, and deal with the paperwork headache tomorrow." She dismissed the class, and they filed out in small groups, conversations already starting about the final evaluations and what challenges they might face. Cross remained behind as the room emptied. "Think they're ready?" he asked Sofia. "Ready as they can be after 8 weeks," she replied. "The real test comes when they're back in the field, facing situations we can't simulate, making calls that matter for real. That's when we'll know if this worked." "It worked," Cross said with surprising certainty. "I've watched these students transform. They think differently now, move differently, respond to pressure differently. Whatever happens in their careers, they're better prepared than they were 8 weeks ago." Sofia nodded, accepting the assessment. "What about you? Are you ready for what comes next?" Cross understood what she was asking. With Graves gone and the program officially continuing, Cross and Sofia would be shaping tactical training philosophy for potentially years. It meant ongoing collaboration, ongoing integration of their approaches, ongoing navigation of institutional politics and operational realities. "I'm ready," he said. "Took me a while to get here, but I understand now that what we're building is bigger than either of our egos. The military needs this. Needs operators who can think as well as fight. Needs training that prepares people for reality instead of idealized scenarios. Even when that means operating outside conventional structures?" Sofia asked. "Especially when that means operating outside conventional structures," Cross replied. "That's where the real challenges are. That's where excellence gets tested. If we only train people for situations that fit existing templates, we're preparing them for the last war, not the next one." They stood together looking at the empty briefing room. At the whiteboard, still carrying the mantra that had defined the program. At the space where two competing philosophies had collided and ultimately synthesized into something neither of them could have created alone. Admiral Holt entered the room, carrying a folder that looked official and probably meant more paperwork. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Of course, sir," Sofia said. Holt set the folder on the briefing table. "JSOC wants to expand the program. They're requesting that we develop a 3-month advanced course for Tier 1 operators. Delta, Devigru, Special Activity Center. The full spectrum. They want what you built here, but deeper. More complex. Designed for people who are already elite and need to evolve beyond elite." Sofia and Cross exchanged glances. It was validation, certainly. Proof that what they'd built had value beyond Naval Station Cascade. But it was also a significant expansion of responsibility. "What's the timeline?" Cross asked. "They want the first course starting in March," Holt said. 3 months to design curriculum, recruit instructors, build scenarios that challenge operators who've already seen everything. It's ambitious. Maybe too ambitious. He looked between them. "Can you do it?" Sofia was quiet for a moment, running through mental calculations about what would be required. Then she smiled slightly, the expression carrying more determination than humor. "Sir, 8 weeks ago, I was one instructor with unproven methods fighting institutional resistance. Now I'm co-director of a validated program with JSOC requesting expansion. If we can integrate competing philosophies and arrest smugglers in the same month, we can design a Tier 1 course in 3. "That's what I hoped you'd say," Holt replied. He opened the folder, revealing preliminary planning documents. "Get started. And Brennan? Cross? Don't make me regret trusting you to build something unprecedented." After Holt left, Sofia and Cross began reviewing the planning documents. Already discussing what Tier 1 training should look like. How to challenge operators who'd spent careers believing they'd mastered their profession. "We're going to need different facilities," Cross said. "More complex environments. Urban, rural, maritime, confined spaces. Everything. And we're going to need scenarios that don't have right answers," Sofia added. "Ethical dilemmas, impossible choices. Situations where every option creates casualties. That's what Tier 1 operators face in reality." They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, building frameworks and designing challenges. Two instructors who'd learned to trust each other, creating something that would test the limits of human performance under pressure. Outside, the base continued its routines. Training exercises, equipment maintenance, administrative functions. The machinery of military readiness turning with practiced precision. But in that briefing room, something different was taking shape. Not just a training program, but a philosophy about what excellence meant in professions where certainty was luxury and perfection was impossible. Sofia paused in her planning to look out the window at the training. grounds where students were running through, close quarters combat drills. Watching them move with the kind of integrated awareness that came from weeks of learning to balance competing priorities, this was the work, she thought. Not the dramatic moments like jewelry store confrontations or nighttime arrests, but the patient, persistent effort to help people become better versions of themselves, to give them tools for navigating complexity, frameworks for making impossible choices, and confidence that they could trust their judgment even when certainty wasn't available. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the base. In a few hours, she'd need to finalize materials for tomorrow's final evaluations. But for now, she let herself appreciate the moment. The quiet satisfaction of work that mattered, of students who'd grown, of partnerships that had evolved from conflict into collaboration. Control wasn't about dominance. It was about choosing how you showed up, what you built, who you became through the work, and in that choice, repeated every day through every challenge, was where real strength lived. 3 months after Peters's arrest, Sofia found herself back at Meridian Fine Jewelers in downtown Portland. Not by coincidence, but by deliberate choice. The store had reopened 2 weeks after the incident. The shattered display cases replaced, the security systems upgraded. The memory of that night existing now primarily in police reports and her own reflections. She'd come to finally pick up her father's watch. The vintage piece that had been repaired and waiting through everything that followed. The store manager, a different person than the one who'd been there that night, processed the transaction with professional efficiency. Unaware of the history contained in these walls, Sofia held the watch in her palm, feeling its weight, the cool metal against her skin. Her father had worn it through Vietnam, through decades of service, through situations where time measured differently than it did in civilian life. He'd given it to her before he died, told her it had kept him grounded when everything around him was chaos. A reminder that seconds mattered, that presence mattered, that showing up with intention was half the battle. She fastened it around her wrist, the familiar gesture connecting her to memory and purpose simultaneously. Outside, Portland moved through its evening rhythms. Workers heading home, restaurants filling up. The city transitioning from day to night with the kind of mundane beauty that only became visible when you'd spent enough time in places where mundane didn't exist. Sofia walked to a coffee shop 3 blocks away, ordered her usual, and sat by the window watching people pass. This was the part of the job nobody talked about. The transitions between intensity and normalcy, the cognitive dissonance of drinking coffee in a peaceful city hours after teaching people how to navigate warfare. Her phone buzzed. A message from Cross. Final course evaluations are in. Everyone passed. Most with scores higher than we expected. Looks like this thing we built actually works. She smiled slightly, typed a response. Never doubted it. Well, maybe doubted it a little. See you Monday for JSOC planning session. Another message, this one from Agent Rhodes. Just got assigned to a joint task force operation. Using everything you taught us. Thanks for preparing us for reality instead of fantasies. Sofia didn't respond to that one. Just absorbed it, added it to the mental collection of confirmations that the work mattered. That the students took something valuable back to their units. The coffee shop played quiet jazz. The kind that filled space without demanding attention. Sofia let herself exist in the moment. No planning, no training scenarios, no assessments. Just breath and observation, and the watch on her wrist marking seconds that belonged to her rather than to any mission. A young couple at the next table was arguing, voices low but intense. Relationship conflict, the kind that felt world-ending to them, but would probably resolve or dissolve within weeks. She caught fragments of their conversation. Trust issues, competing priorities, fundamental questions about what they wanted from each other. She thought about her conversation with Cross all those weeks ago. about how they'd spent weeks arguing before learning to work together, how competing philosophies had felt incompatible until they'd both been willing to see value in approaches different from their own. Most conflicts, she'd learned, weren't actually about who was right. They were about people protecting identities they'd built around specific ways of seeing the world. Change felt like loss. Adaptation felt like surrender. So people dug in, defended positions, chose being right over being effective. The couple eventually left, still unresolved, carrying their conflict out into the Portland evening. Sofia hoped they'd figure it out. Hoped they'd learn what she and Cross had learned, that synthesis was stronger than victory. Her phone buzzed again. This time, Admiral Holt, State Department requesting consultation on hostage negotiation training. Interested? She considered that. State Department meant diplomatic security, meant protection details for personnel in hostile environments, meant a different context than military operations, but similar principles. More gray zones. More situations where doctrine had limits and judgment mattered. Send details, she typed back. Probably interested. The work kept expanding. Each successful program led to more requests, more organizations recognizing that the kind of training she provided filled gaps that traditional approaches couldn't address. It was gratifying and exhausting in equal measure. She finished her coffee, stood, and walked back out into the evening. The jewelry store was visible from here, its lights warm against the darkening sky. She thought about that night, about Vargas and his partners, about the moment when a gun pressed against her temple, and she'd made the choice to stay calm rather than panic. People asked her sometimes how she'd known it would work, how she'd been certain he wouldn't pull the trigger. The truth was she hadn't been certain. She'd assessed probabilities, read micro-expressions, calculated risks. But certainty? That didn't exist in moments like that. You made your best judgment with available information, and accepted that outcomes might prove you wrong. The difference between her and most people wasn't that she had some special courage or supernatural calm. It was that she'd trained herself to act despite uncertainty, to trust her assessment even when she couldn't guarantee its accuracy, to accept that fear was information rather than instruction. That was the real lesson she'd been teaching all along. Not techniques or tactics, though those mattered, but the fundamental capacity to operate in spaces where certainty didn't exist, where every choice carried risk, where the only guarantee was that you'd have to live with whatever consequences your decisions created. She walked through downtown Portland as night settled fully, the city lights reflecting off wet pavement from an earlier rain. Somewhere in this city, officers were responding to calls, making decisions under pressure, navigating situations their training had prepared them for in some ways and left them vulnerable in others. Somewhere across the country, the students from her program were doing the same, applying principles they'd learned, adapting to contexts she'd never anticipate, becoming the kind of operators who could think as well as act. The work rippled outward in ways she'd never fully track. Every student who learned to stay present under pressure would make different choices than they would have otherwise. Some of those choices would save lives. Others might create complications. All of them would matter. Sofia reached her car, parked in a garage 3 blocks from the coffee shop. Before getting in, she took a moment to breathe, to feel the weight of the watch on her wrist, to acknowledge the distance between the person who'd walked into Meridian Fine Jewelers 8 weeks ago and the person standing here now. Not different, exactly, but more certain about what mattered, more committed to the work, more willing to operate in the uncomfortable spaces where excellence got tested, and doctrine had limits. She drove back toward the base, thinking about Monday's JSOC planning session, about the Tier 1 course they were designing, about all the challenges that would come with teaching operators who already believed they'd mastered their profession. But that was Monday. Tonight was for the drive, for the quiet, for the transition between one intensity and the next. Her phone connected to the car's audio system, played a podcast about leadership philosophy. She half listened, her mind partly on the content and partly on the watch keeping time on her wrist. When she arrived back at the base, the guard at the gate recognized her, waved her through without the usual credential check. She parked near her quarters, grabbed her bag, and walked through the quiet facility. Tomorrow she'd run a morning session with students, preparing for their first deployment. Next week she'd begin preliminary work on the JSOC course. Next month there'd be some new crisis or challenge that demanded response. But tonight, she'd sleep in her quarters, in a bed that didn't move, under a roof that didn't leak. In a country where violence was exception rather than rule, the privileges of this profession were strange ones. Safety earned through proximity to danger. Peace maintained through preparation for war. Normalcy protected by people willing to operate in spaces where normal didn't exist. Sofia entered her quarters, set down her bag, looked at the watch one more time before removing it and placing it carefully on the nightstand. Her father's voice echoed in memory. Time is the only resource you can't recover. Spend it on things that matter. She'd spent 8 weeks teaching students how to own their time, how to find stillness in chaos, how to make impossible choices with imperfect information. She'd arrested a smuggler, partnered with a former adversary, built a training program that challenged conventional doctrine. And tomorrow she'd wake up and do more of the same. Not because it was easy or comfortable or guaranteed to succeed, but because it mattered. Because somewhere, operators were facing situations where the difference between panic and presence determined who lived and who died. That was enough. That was everything. She lay down, closed her eyes, and let herself drift towards sleep. Her breathing slowed, deepened, found the rhythm she'd trained thousands of hours to perfect. The kind of breath that sounded more like choice than reflex. In the darkness of her quarters, wearing clothes that still smelled faintly of coffee and Portland rain, Commander Sofia Brennan did what she'd been teaching others to do for years. She let go of control over outcomes she couldn't determine. She accepted that tomorrow would bring challenges she couldn't predict. She trusted that her training, her judgment, her willingness to operate in gray zones would be enough. And she rested, because control wasn't about forcing outcomes or eliminating uncertainty. Control was about choosing how you showed up, what you built, who you became through the work. And in that choice, repeated every day through every challenge, was where real strength lived, not in the absence of fear, but in the refusal to let fear make your decisions. Not in certainty, but in the willingness to act despite uncertainty. Not in dominance, but in presence. The kind of presence that could stand in a jewelry store with a gun pressed against her temple and speak, with enough calm to shift the entire situation. The kind of presence that could walk into an office where an armed suspect waited and de-escalate through understanding, rather than force. The kind of presence that could teach competing philosophies to work together, that could build partnerships from conflict, that could show students how to navigate complexity without losing themselves in it. That was the lesson. That was the work. And tomorrow, she'd wake up and continue teaching it, because some things couldn't be learned from manuals or memorized from briefings. Some things had to be demonstrated, practiced, lived. And someone had to be willing to stand in those spaces where theory met reality and show others what was possible. Sofia Brennan had chosen to be that someone, and she'd keep choosing it. Every morning, every crisis, every moment that mattered, until the work was done, or until she was, whichever came first. Outside her window, the base settled into its nighttime rhythms. Guards walking perimeters, equipment humming in distant buildings, the machinery of readiness turning through darkness toward dawn. And in her quarters, breathing steady and measured, Sofia slept, the kind of sleep that comes from knowing you showed up fully to the days, Demands. The kind of rest that prepares you for whatever tomorrow brings. The kind of peace that only exists on the other side of choosing difficult things and seeing them through. Her father's watch sat on the knitstand, keeping time, marking seconds that belonged to her, counting moments toward a future where more operators would know how to find stillness in chaos, where presence would be valued as much as speed. Where wisdom would matter as much as courage. That future wasn't guaranteed. It was possible. And possibility, Sofia had learned, was where everything worth building began. So what would you do if someone pressed a gun to your head? Would you have the training to stay still, to read fear in their movements, to speak with the kind of calm that shifts entire situations? Or would instinct take over, turning a survivable moment into something irreversible? Most of us will never face that choice. But we all face moments where pressure builds, where fear demands response, where the space between reaction and action determines outcomes. The lesson isn't about guns. It's about control. Real control isn't loud. It isn't aggressive. It doesn't prove itself through force. Real control is the breath you take before speaking, the pause before reacting, the moment you choose presence over panic. It's the difference between being driven by circumstance and directing it. That's not natural. It's trained. And if you found value in Sofia's story, if something in these 12 parts made you reconsider what strength actually means, then do 3 things. 1. Hit that like button. It tells me this kind of storytelling matters to you. 2. Subscribe and turn on notifications. I share stories about real competence, about people who've mastered skills that can't be measured in typical ways. 3. Share this with someone who confuses volume for authority, who thinks control means domination, who needs to understand that the quietest people in the room are often the most dangerous, because stories like Sofia's don't just entertain. They teach, they challenge, they show us what's possible when we stop reacting and start responding. Drop a comment. Tell me, what does control mean to you? The pause before action or the action itself? I read every single one. Now go be someone who owns their time instead of letting time own them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.